Chapter 657. Sun Pin sat uneasily in the side hall. She sat very properly and wore a blue robe. She was so fresh and elegant that she did not seem like a guest. She was overly cautious. In the morning, she had already come to the Fan Manor. Her mind had long become a mess. For a moment, she was angry and embarrassed that she, a girl, had come to the manor without any shame to ask for an audience. For a moment, she thought of her father sighing at home. She was very worried. In the corner of her heart, the most frantic part was occupied by Fan Xian's appearance. It had been 3 years since she had seen Sir Fan Jr. Although the serving girls often heard rumors from outside and talked about it in the room, Sun Pin knew that he had lived well these 3 years. He had a son and a daughter, and his family was harmonious. There were also no problems in court. Her heart was comforted to the extreme. Sun Pin wanted to see Fan Xian, but she knew that if she actually saw Sir Fan Jr., it would be very inappropriate. For a moment, she could not cut it off or sort it out. She hoped that he would take the time to summon her, but she also hoped that he was not in the manor and that she could go back quietly. The tea on the long table was slightly cold. Another serving girl came up to change it. This was already the 4th cup of tea. From sitting in the morning until now, the Fan Manor had not treated the young lady of the Sun family coldly. After the Teng family returned from the medical shop, they began to chat with her respectfully and calmly. After talking for a number of hours, the words from the woman's mouth did not repeat anything. Sun Pin knew that this woman was the housekeeper of the Fan Manor and did not treat her lightly. Hearing that Princess Chen was not in the manor, she let out a breath in her heart. Everyone knew that the princess of the Duke's manor was the most gentle and amiable. She never expressed any opinion on matters of the outside world. She only did her best to host the Hangzhou conference and seek benefits for the poor people of the Qing kingdom. Her benevolent heart was greatly admired by everyone. However, Sun Pin knew the rumors in the capital, so she was always afraid. After waiting for a long time, the Teng family only said that Junzhu had gone to the palace and the Duke had gone on an errand and wasn't in the Fu. They didn't have a host to entertain them and asked Miss Sun to be understanding. Sun Pin had already seen with her sharp eyes that there were officials coming in and out of the garden. She had already guessed that Sir Fan Jr. was probably hiding in the back garden and unwilling to see her. Slightly disappointed, she was about to rise to say goodbye. Unexpectedly, the Teng family refused to continue her conversation. Sun Pin was slightly shocked. She guessed that the people in the back garden were probably discussing something about her arrival, so she calmly sat down. Before long, Fan Ruoruo walked into the side hall. Sun Pin quickly rose and bowed. The two women looked at each other and said something in soft and warm words. Fan Ruoruo then quietly repeated what Fan Xian had told her. Sun Pin's heart was filled with joy. She thought that if Sir Fan Jr. was willing to come the day after tomorrow, it would be wonderful. She quickly expressed her thanks, exchanged a few more polite words, and was about to leave. Fan Ruoruo saw clearly the girl's joy and faint melancholy and couldn't help but sigh in her heart. She thought that her brother really had too many emotional debts. She couldn't resist saying quietly, "My brother is in the back garden." However, there are differences between men and women, so it is not convenient for him to come out and meet. Please understand his painstaking efforts. Sun Pin's body shook. She sensed some other meaning from the sudden addition of these words from the young lady of the Fan family. It seemed that she had faintly grasped Sir Fan Jr.'s difficulties and tenderness toward her. Her cheeks blushed slightly. Her heart was filled with endless gratitude. She bowed deeply and left. Fan Ruoruo looked at the girl's back and couldn't resist laughing bitterly. She turned her head and saw Fan Xian's furtive appearance. She smiled and said, "She's already gone. What are you looking at?" She paused and then said, "But, she understood your meaning." It looked like she was very grateful. Speaking of this, she couldn't resist a rare glare at Fan Xian and said, Can you not be so careful? You seem to be thinking for Miss Sun, but who knows how deeply you've sunk her. Only after these words were spoken did Ruoruo realize that her words seemed to reveal a sense of darkness. Her heart jumped and she quickly hid it with a smile. There is something I forgot to tell you. We all misheard earlier. Fan Xian didn't pay attention to these words. He only smiled bitterly and sighed. When did being a good person become a bad thing? After successfully avoiding the young lady of the Sun family and comforting his sister, Fan Xian became idle again. Crossing his legs, he read the letters from Shi Chanli and Su Wenmao as he quietly hummed something. The diplomatic group in Dongyi was still dawdling. Sigu Jian estimated that they could hold out for another 2 days. He was not in a rush. It would be fine to stay another 6 or 7 days in Jingdou. It had been a long time since he had carefully dealt with his personal affairs. It was perfect for him to put some effort into it. Su Wenmao's position in the 3 large workshops of the palace treasury in North Min was becoming more and more stable. With Ren Xiaoan's clansman as a helper, in addition to the close cooperation between the Overwatch Council and the Palace Treasury Transport Company, the former second-in-command had now become the leader of the 3 large workshops. Of course, this was mainly because he represented Fan Xian's will. Shi Chanli was still traveling around the world. 5 years had already passed. The scholar of the past had already accepted, half helplessly and half willingly, that he had no fate with an official career. If he was truly willing, it would not be difficult for Fan Xian to arrange an official position or 2 for him. However, Shi Chanli knew that in his teacher's heart, he was not the same as the other 3. The things he had to do could not see the light of day and were more important. For the sake of Baoyue Brothel's intelligence system and silver circulation, he was willing to give up some important things to help his teacher. Of course, no one dared to disrespect the present owner of Baoyue Brothel as he traveled the world. As a merchant, Shi Chanli was actually much more at ease than officials like Ji Chang and Wan Li. Even if Fan Xian decided to have Shi Chanli re-enter the official ranks, this brothel owner would still have to think carefully. In reality, he did not understand Fan Xian as well as Sang Wen did. Fan Xian had built Baoyue Brothel all over the world. At the beginning, his starting point was truly because he pitied those pitiful women whose fates were not in their own hands. He tried to use Baoyue Brothel to influence the lowest profession from ancient times to now. He did not seek absolute justice, but at least he had to lean toward the proper. After Fan Xian finished reading Shi Chanli's letter, he couldn't resist smiling. Looking at the stammering words in the letter, Shi Chanli and Sang Wen probably couldn't resist the long years of working together and finally developing some faint feelings. Shi Chanli wanted Fan Xian to make the decision, but he didn't dare say it explicitly. Fan Xian felt that this matter was quite amusing. He had never thought of sending these 2 people to the same pile. From the beginning, he knew at Sang Wen's side there was a lonely Jianghu man who wholeheartedly wanted to be her protector. He didn't know what the situation at Sang Wen's side was like. Sang Wen's gentleness, Sang Wen's lips, and Sang Wen's attentiveness and low profile were all qualities that Fan Xian liked. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken her out of the brothel back then. Now that she and Shi Chanli were both older, it seemed that it was time to consider these things. As Fan Xian thought this, he crumpled the letter in his hand into snowflakes. Tilting his head, he sat in the chair in a daze. He had calculated the power in his hands many times, but he had never thought about it as clearly as he did today. The Overwatch Council and the Palace Treasury were naturally the 2 most powerful weapons in his hands. If the emperor sent down an edict, he estimated that at most 20 to 30% of the people in the Overwatch Council would stand firmly behind Fan Xian. That lump of ice will probably stand in the middle. He will certainly not disobey the edict, but he shouldn't act against me either. Fan Xian silently thought about whether or not his friendship with Yan Bingyun would be able to stand the test of time in the future. Immediately after, he thought to himself, in the entire Overwatch Council, of the First Bureau, Third Bureau, and Fourth Bureau, his control was the strongest. The only people who could truly follow him through mountains of knives and seas of fire were the people of the Qinian unit. Fan Xian had begun to tamper with the palace treasury a few years ago. He believed that if the situation changed in the future, he would certainly have a way to make a powerful response. The palace treasury was a divine weapon that Fan Xian could use to fight against the might of heaven. Shi Chanli and Su Wenmao's loyalty was definitely trustworthy. Additionally, there was Deng Ziyu, who was now in Xiliang. Fan Xian suddenly realized that the power in his hands was indeed very strong. Furthermore, there were faint signs that it was about to break away from the emperor's control. No wonder the emperor had begun to experiment with the future arrangements of court politics. A glimmer of a smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. He thought that in the end, the emperor still had not discovered the most important point. He would go fight him the day after tomorrow and confirm and protect the power in his hands. He should be able to hold out for a few more years. Just as he and Haitang had once said, this world was those old people's and also theirs. In the end, it would always be theirs. All they needed was time. One day at the end of April, the spring flowers had not been destroyed by the heat and wind. Instead, they were scattered to the ground by a sudden spring rain. The flowering trees that stretched out from the courtyards on the long streets in the south of Jingdo watched helplessly as their clothes were torn into shreds by the seemingly gentle but actually merciless spring wind. They fell to the stone ground outside the courtyard walls and were stepped on by hurrying pedestrians. They sank deep into the mud, revealing only the pink edges. The manor of the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, was on the main street in the south of the city. Not far behind this manor was the Jingdo Yamen. However, the hall of the Yamen was on the other side. The peace of power and wealth depended on each other but did not interfere with each other. Today was not Sun Jingxiu's birthday. Rather, it was his old mother's 80th birthday. It was indeed an important day. What Fan Ruoruo said the day before yesterday was that she had misheard. The old matriarch of the Sun Manor was also someone with a title. Sun Jingxiu rarely did anything, so when the various invitations were sent out, the officials would always come and entertain him. Although there were no red ribbons and colored lanterns hanging outside the Sun Manor's door, they had purposely added a sense of celebration. There were many people coming and going with gifts, but not many carriages came. On the long street, the housekeepers and servants only delivered the gift lists and boxes into the manor as usual. After saying a few words of apology on behalf of their masters, they left the Sun Manor. Some of the lower-ranking officials who did not know the inside story couldn't help but feel surprised when they saw this scene. They thought that the birthday of the Jingdo magistrate shouldn't be so deserted. It was a far cry from the bustling scene of the manors of other nobles. The Jingdo government was in charge of the safety of the entire Jingdo people. The people they dealt with were mostly the various yamens, various manors, nobles, and various officials. Thus, it was difficult for the Jingdo government to do their jobs. However, the Jingdo government's status was also high. When the second prince fought for the throne, he had put a lot of effort into the Jingdo government. Normally speaking, no official would not give the Jingdo government face. Today's scene was indeed a little surprising. The people around the corner door were whispering among themselves. No one knew what they were discussing. However, they occasionally thought of the rumors of the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, in officialdom and felt that this was a natural thing. Sun Jingxiu was, without question, the luckiest person in the entire Qing officialdom. He was not a proper juren. Rather, he was a scribe. From the moment he became an official, he had been doing administrative work in the Jingdo government. He had been doing this for half his life. Given his background and lack of background, in such an important place, even if he worked for 3 lifetimes, he probably wouldn't be able to rise to the position of Jingdo magistrate. However, during these 6 or 7 years in the Qing kingdom, the crown prince and second prince fought for the throne. After Sir Fan Jr. entered the capital, there were chaotic battles. The Jingdo government, which was in an important place, became the most important place for the various powers to fight over. The Jingdo magistrate was not like the governors of the various roads. The various magistrates were far away from the emperor, so they could protect themselves and not lean toward any prince. The government was in Jingdo, so no power would let them go. The Jingdo magistrate had to make his stance clear. Thus, Meijili was forced away, and the Jingdo magistrate that the second prince had helped into power was forced down. In a short 5 or 6 years, a number of Jingdo magistrates had fallen. No official had the courage to forcefully ask for this position. Thus, Sun Jingxiu, the of the Jingdo government, coincidentally sat in the position of the Jingdo magistrate. In the past, the Jingdo magistrate also held the position of a scholar in court. However, after Meijili, this rule became chaotic. By Sun Jingxiu's time, he was a bachelor Jingdo magistrate without any title of nobility. Thus, in officialdom, the officials all carried a glimmer of jealousy and disdain in their comments. Sun Jingxiu was the luckiest Jingdo magistrate in history, but he was also the Jingdo magistrate with the least power. Who knew when he would be kicked off the stage? However, Sun Jingxiu had his strong points. His long years of paperwork made him not good at interacting with officials. He was also not used to sucking up to the scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He threw himself wholeheartedly into state affairs. His conduct was honest and serious. He never took the rumors outside to heart. It was this kind of personality that made him, who had not seen the so-called emperor's posthumous edict in the autumn of the 7th year of the Qing calendar, accept the Empress Dowager's edict and do his best to put Fan Xian on the wanted list in Jingdo. The affairs of the world were difficult to predict. Who knew that the emperor had not died? Who knew that Sir Fan Jr. was a loyal official? Each time he thought of this, Sun Jingxiu couldn't help but feel a lingering fear. It was fortunate that he had raised a good girl, which allowed him to find a backer in court for the first time. Furthermore, it was the highest backer in court. Thus, the officials became even more jealous. The rumors of him selling his daughter for glory spread for a long time before they finally died down under Fan Xian's powerful suppression. 3 years had passed. The officials found that the connection between the Fan manor and the Jingdo government was not close. Only then did they believe that the legend in the boudoir was only a legend. There was no follow-up story. It was because they believed that Sir Fan Jr. and the Jingdo government did not have any relationship between a man and a woman that the front door of the Sun Manor appeared so cold and cheerless. It was even more cheerless than the flowering trees by the side of the street. The housekeepers from the various manors who had given their gifts left the Sun Manor but did not leave the south of the city. Instead, they cleverly chose a tea house at the end of the street to rest for the time being. It was not even noon yet, but this luxuriously decorated tea house was already bustling with noise and excitement. The stewards who were familiar with each other greeted each other with a smile and invited each other to sit in the middle of the table. In a short while, half of the tea house was filled. The smiles of the housekeepers were strange. They all revealed a tacit understanding and a faint disdain toward the Jingdo government. The masters of these housekeepers were either officials of the 6 ministries or officials of the 3 temples. Some were nobles from the Duke's Alley. Today, they only sent gifts, but they did not come in person. The fact that these housekeepers were gathered in the tea house and did not immediately return to the manor to report on the completion of the mission meant that these nobles and officials knew very well what the Sun Manor's birthday celebration represented. Sun Jingxiu was muddle-headed. This was the common thought of all the civil and military officials. Since Scholar He of the Hall of Governmental Affairs had already leaked the news, it was the person in the palace who had the idea. You still don't dare to immediately resign, yet you still want to hold a birthday celebration at this time? Do you want to see the palace's attitude? Do you want to see the rumors in officialdom? Or do you want to see something? However, these nobles and officials did not want to take things too far, so they had the housekeepers keep watch near the Sun Manor after they gave the gifts. They didn't know what exactly would happen. More accurately speaking, they were still a bit afraid of whether the rumor that had been quiet for almost 2 years was true or not. They didn't know whether or not the Duke of Danbo would personally come. Logically speaking, given Fan Xian's identity, the Jingdo government's business should not disturb him. However, the officials were all cunning people, so they still needed to make a final confirmation. Whose family's sedan chair is that? A housekeeper who was talking about romance suddenly narrowed his eyes and saw a large sedan chair pass by the door of the Sun Manor. Looking at the number of people and the decorations on the curtains, it should not be of a low rank. The matter of the Jingdo magistrate changing was still in the rumor stage. All of the officials knew that this was the first time the popular He Zongwei, with the emperor's support, had independently completed a highly influential personnel change. Thus, the officials of the various departments cleverly stood behind He Zongwei. No one would stand in front of Sir He at this time. Today's birthday banquet was a good time to pick a side. Everyone wanted to get closer to the young and gentle scholar He. Thus, the entrance to the Sun Manor was cold and cheerless. At this time, a rather eye-catching sedan stopped at the entrance to the Sun Manor. The housekeeper of the assistant minister of the Ministry of Appointments laughingly scolded, "It's probably some manor that doesn't participate in politics." The assistant minister of the Ministry of Appointments had a good relationship with He Zongwei and knew the inside story of this matter. Thus, he had never thought of coming. Even this housekeeper's tone was slightly mocking. Unexpectedly, a housekeeper shook his head and said, "Something's not right. It looks like Duke Lu's manor." After these words were said, the housekeepers who had come from the Duke's alley to deliver gifts quickly walked to the side of the railing. They looked for a moment and their expressions gradually changed. However, they didn't say anything to the people beside them. They met each other's eyes nervously. Taking advantage of the fact that the other housekeepers had not reacted, they sneakily slipped down the stairs. The other housekeepers in the tea house did not notice the commotion. They were just curious. Why would Duke Lu, who never participated in politics, lower himself to give the Sun family face? Immediately after, another large sedan chair slowly came from the north of the city and landed in front of the Sun Manor's door. From a distance, it could be seen that the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, had just received the duke into his manor. At this moment, he was crawling out again. He was so shocked that he was about to fall to the ground. A housekeeper in the tea house cried out in a sharp voice, "It's old Prince Jing." As soon as these words came out, a strange and quiet atmosphere enveloped the tea house that was previously very chaotic. All the stewards stopped talking and began to quickly calculate in their minds, trying to guess what this shocking scene in front of them meant. Some of the smarter people had already connected Duke Lu and King Jing, two noble figures who would never appear in the Jingdo government, to another important figure. Their faces suddenly became deathly white as they quietly went down the tea house. The remaining housekeepers were still staring nervously at the door of the Sun Manor. It was as if they did not believe their eyes. They did not believe that Sun Jingxiu, this lonely old man, would be able to invite these two people to come out and help him. At this moment, two unremarkable black carriages drove steadily along the streets in the south of the city. They drove past the tea house and stopped in front of the Sun Manor's door. The black carriages were unremarkable and eye-piercing. The faces of everyone in the tea house all paled as they watched the young duke walk down from the carriage. Even more awkwardly, they watched the magnificently dressed princess slowly ascend the stairs with the duke's support. In an instant, the tea house became incomparably quiet. All the stewards rushed downstairs at lightning speed and rushed back to their own mansions. They had to notify their masters. Sir Fan Jr. had come, Princess Chen had come, King Jing had come, Duke Lu had come. Who are you? Hurry and go. Even if the Duke of Danbo only wanted to slap He Zongwei's face, you still had to go and watch with a smile, no? For a moment, the manners of the officials in the south of Jingdo fell into chaos. Those who were looking for clothes looked for clothes, those who were sending messages sent messages, and those who were preparing new gifts prepared new gifts. But all the officials only had one goal, and that was the Sun residence. Most of the officials who had nothing to do with the matter faintly guessed why the little duke was going to the Sun Manor. Other than shock in their hearts, they couldn't help but feel a little excited. Jingdo had been peaceful for too long. It would be a good show to see how Sir Fan Jr. bullied the scholar and the officials of the various departments. Chapter 658. Lin Yichen, Best Female Lead, Fan Xian, Worst Male Lead, me, Best Screenwriter. Thank you, everyone, for your hard work and support last month. I'm very happy, thank you very much. I won't be pretentious at all, I'm really happy. Because I didn't write much, I still managed to get so many votes in the end. Everyone did a much better job than me. Lao Wu has always been much more hardworking than me, so I'm already very happy to be ranked 4th. The difference isn't that big, it's all because of everyone's continuous support. Thank you very much. After I finished writing yesterday, I went straight to deliver food. Then, I almost forgot the shouting trick I learned from Liang Hechuan. I could only ask the leader from afar to do it. It felt good, it felt good. I still can't write too much in the first few days of this month, I'm really sorry. Of course, one day, I'll try to work harder. I still have to continue canvassing votes. Brothers and sisters who have guaranteed monthly votes, if you want to spend it, please hurry up and do it. Thank you very much. Then, I thank myself, because I know I'll work hard and seriously write my book this month, next month, this year, next year, and most likely for the rest of my life. Because I really like writing. Then, I turn back to thank everyone again, because I'm definitely going to get the few 103,000 word update votes yesterday. While laughing. Seriously speaking, I really don't want everyone to spend this money. In the past, I didn't think it was convenient to say it directly in the book, but today, I can't help but say it. Don't vote for the update votes. No matter how small a mosquito is, it's still meat. $1 has its uses. The money I get from subscriptions is my legitimate income, the monthly votes reward is everyone's encouragement, and the update votes reward is something I don't feel good about. I'll continue writing. Everyone knows me, I can last, I don't need the temptation of the update votes, although I don't write much every day. If you vote for 12,000, but I can't write it, then I won't get it. If you vote for 3,000, but I write smoothly, then I might be able to write an entire 20,000 word chapter. I understand that everyone is encouraging me, but it's fine to save some money, right? Chapter 659. The Qing kingdom governed the world with filial piety. When the wise and brilliant emperor moved a large amount of silver from the national treasury to build a mausoleum for the dead Empress Dowager, the scholars Shu and Hu only expressed their worry on the surface. Fan Xian could not be bothered to pay attention to this matter. Sun Jingxiu was celebrating his mother's birthday, so it was much more important than his own. It was because of this matter that he had the courage to invite Fan Xian. When Sir Fan Jr. actually held Princess Chen's hand and stepped through the front door of the manor, Sun Jingxiu still found it difficult to suppress his excitement. His life these few months had been precarious. It seemed that in an instant, all of the officials and yamens had begun to watch him. It made him feel like there was a thorn in his back and he could not rest easy. After thinking it over, he still thought it was Fan Xian. However, the Sun Manor and the Fan family did not actually have a deep connection, so he didn't know if it would work or not. It worked. Although Sun Jingxiu's lips tasted bitter and gloomy, and he felt a great deal of guilt toward his daughter, he looked at Fan Xian's handsome face and still bowed respectfully. He then welcomed the pair into the manor. The manor had long been properly arranged. All of the female guests were in the back garden. The people sitting in the front yard were all the main officials of the Jingdo government. The 3 halls, the front and back, that had been specially left open for the officials of the court, were currently empty and eye-piercing. Fan Xian followed Sun Jingxiu inside. Looking at the long, empty tables, he couldn't resist smiling. Lin Wan quietly said something by his ear. Accompanied by the nannies and carefully served by the women of the Sun Manor, she walked toward the back garden. Turning to the west wing, Fan Xian followed Sun Jingxiu into the study. He already knew that King Jing and Duke Lu had already arrived. The two noble elders were currently chatting with Sir Sun's mother. At their age and seniority, they didn't pay much attention to etiquette. The study was very quiet. Fan Xian looked at Sun Jingxiu and said with a smile, "Sir Sun, you are truly not a smart person." Before the banquet began, Sun Jingxiu was afraid of neglecting Sir Fan Jr., so he personally accompanied him into the study. The servants had not yet brought the tea, but Fan Xian had already said these words calmly and directly. Sun Jingxiu's heart involuntarily jumped. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. "I'm curious." Fan Xian looked at him and said in an even voice, "In the past, you never used these methods to figure out the emperor's heart. Why are you doing the opposite this year? Why do you want to borrow my power to see what's happening in officialdom? I am surprised that you are not a person who cares about power and wealth." Sun Jingxiu was silent for a moment. He then raised his hands in respect and said, "Jingxiu thinks that I have been rather particular in being the Jingdo magistrate. Please take pity on me." Fan Xian gently knocked on the table as if he was thinking about the propriety of the situation. He had not expected Sun Jingxiu to make such a direct request. However, he also liked direct negotiations. A moment later, he nodded slightly and said, "I'll speak for you in the palace." "What about Lord He?" Sun Jingxiu was overjoyed, but he still maintained a calm expression as he asked in a trembling voice. Fan Xian lowered his eyelids slightly and said, "He is the imperial censor of the left. I can't control him." Sun Jingxiu was slightly shocked. Fan Xian raised his head and said with a slight smile, "However, he is only an advisor of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. If who the scholar doesn't nod his head, what can he do to you, the Jingdo magistrate?" The conversation in the study ended very quickly. Fan Xian did not have Sun Jingxiu spit out any mushy words in front of him. They both knew that since Fan Xian was willing to help Sun Jingxiu with such a large favor, Sun Jingxiu could only sell his life to Fan Xian. The Jingdo magistrate was not an idle position. When Sun Jingxiu glanced toward the officialdom, he could only see the back of Fan Xian's head. He had no other choice. Just as Fan Xian and Sun Jingxiu were chatting, the stewards and servants of the Sun Manor stared dumbfoundedly at the endless stream of official sedan chairs coming in from outside the manor. They looked at the famous people in court coming with smiles and warmth to offer birthday wishes. They couldn't help but wonder where these people had run off to earlier. A servant went into the study to notify him. Sun Jingxiu couldn't help smiling bitterly. He knew that the reason these people's attitudes had changed so quickly was all because Sir Fan Jr. had personally come. Furthermore, he had asked King Jing and Duke Lu to be the axes. Fan Xian saw the bitterness in his heart and said with a smile, "The matters of officialdom are just this shameless. You've endured in the Jingdo government for so long. You should get used to it. Otherwise, how many more years can you endure if you're always sulking?" Sun Jingxiu nodded his head in acknowledgement. There were only 3 tables set up in the main hall. The women were all arranged thoughtfully in the back garden. Fan Xian only followed Wan'er to chat with old Sun Matriarch for a bit before retreating. The main seat in the middle of the banquet was temporarily empty. Naturally, King Jing unceremoniously sat in the most honorable seat. High Duke Lu, on the other hand, sat diagonally across from him in the number 2 seat. The two elders had known each other their entire lives. Although they sat a little far from each other, their voices were loud when they spoke. It was as if a casual conversation had turned into an argument. As usual, King Jing's mouth was full of filthy language. With each sentence, he would bring in a few words. It made the officials at the 3 tables in the hall uncomfortable. Unfortunately, High Duke Lu was someone who had retired from the army, so he was familiar with this routine. Sun Jingxiu was entertaining the other officials. Fan Xian sat between King Jing and Duke Lu, smiling, chatting, and eating and drinking with them. He was at ease. King Jing and the Fan Manor were old friends, so their friendship did not need to be mentioned. Duke Lu was Lady Lu's biological father. On the surface, he was Fan Xian's maternal grandfather, so Fan Xian was incomparably respectful. He talked with Duke Lu about the matters in Danzhou. Lady Lu was doing very well. As a maternal grandfather, he was at ease. Additionally, with Fan Xian looking after them, the children and grandchildren in the Duke's Alley all had their own piece of land. Chatting with King Jing was a bit of a headache. This old man would vaguely bring up matters like the medical shop in just a few sentences. Fan Xian sighed quietly in his heart. He didn't know if there was a possibility between Hongcheng and Ruoruo. Speaking of Crown Princely Hongcheng, after the new year, as the general of Dingzhou, he could not always stay in Jingdou fighting with the scholar. He had no choice but to return to the west. However, he left a group of personal guards outside the Donbua medical shop to keep an eye on it day in and day out. The emperor knew he was messing around and was also very angry, but there was nothing he could do. The guests gradually all arrived. 3 ministers, 2 officials, 7 or 8 vice-ministers, and more than half of the important officials in the Qing court had come. Given the Jingdou magistrate's reputation, he could not bring in so many important figures. However, Fan Xian's reputation had this kind of killing power. As time passed, Fan Xian began to have a headache. These ministers and vice-ministers came to greet him. Naturally, he had to rise to greet them and accept their considerate greetings. Seeing that the 3 tables of people had come down, they were also a bit tired. However, this was not the end. There were still many officials in the outer courtyard who took turns coming in to greet him. They did not want to pass up this rare opportunity to see Sir Fan Jr. After one round, the entire hall floated with the sound of flattery. Fan Xian's expression changed several times as he was flattered by dozens of officials. The feeling of being flattered by dozens of officials was not a good one. After 3 rounds of drinking, another official began to mention Fan Xian's extraordinary service in Dongyi. Everyone's gazes looking at him became heated. At this moment, not many people cared about the scholar He Zongwei. After all, this little duke was the emperor's own son. Furthermore, he had done so much for the Qing kingdom these years. He was truly an extremely popular figure. What could the ruling class do? It was not impossible for him to split the land and be made a king. Fan Xian's head hurt. He wondered if these officials had come to wish the old matriarch of the Sun Manor a birthday or had they come specially to flatter him. When all was said and done, he understood. If they had not come specially to flatter him, why would these officials come? It was clear that King Jing was also very interested in the Dongyi matter. He pulled him to his side and asked in detail about some confidential matters. However, it would take at least half a year to finish negotiating the treaty, so Fan Xian could not say anything. He only picked some unimportant matters and secretly told them to the old gardener. The low-ranking officials didn't have to care about fawning, but the ministers and vice-ministers sitting in the main hall still had to put on a calm expression. They only occasionally swept their gazes over Fan Xian's face. Fan Xian turned a blind eye to them. He knew these people were waiting for him to explode and then they would see how he would deal with the subsequent matters. The sun gradually moved, and the noise of drinking outside also stopped. After drinking a few cups of wine, King Jing and High Duke Lu felt that their heads were a little heavy and their bodies were a little tired. They didn't want to see what was going to happen next, so they found an excuse to leave. Sun Jingxiu respectfully saw the 2 nobles out of the main door before returning to the main hall. After thinking for a moment, he ordered the servants to stand guard outside the main hall and pay attention to any activity. He stepped in and apologized to the officials at the 3 tables in the hall. He chuckled and chatted idly. After declining for a while, he finally sat back down in the main seat at the head of the table. The main hall gradually quieted down. Everyone unconsciously stopped and put down their cups. Looking at the various dishes in front of them, they used peaceful smiles on their faces to show their official manner and breadth of mind as they waited for what would happen next. First, Sun Jingxiu sincerely expressed his thanks and so on. Then, he also closed his mouth and sat by Fan Xian's side. He was very calm. Fan Xian's eyelids drooped slightly. He slowly put down the chopsticks in his hand. The ivory chopsticks landed on the green porcelain chopsticks pillow and made a light clinking sound. All of the officials' hearts were struck by this sound. There was an uncomfortable silence. The entire main hall was quiet. Compared to the liveliness in the courtyard and the music from the back garden, it was extremely quiet. I will not say more about Sir Sun's official reputation. Fan Xian raised his head and gently opened his thin lips. The emperor also has many words of praise and encouragement in private. Hearing these words, the officials at the banquet felt it was quite ironic. If the emperor truly liked this Jingdo magistrate, how could he have let out that rumor? However, the duke said in private. Who would know what the father and son said in private? Would these people at the banquet dare to ask something in front of the emperor's face? Everyone is an official in the same court. Everyone has times when things aren't going their way. I hope you can help each other out. Fan Xian's words were very lacking. First of all, he brought out Sun Jingxiu's predicament and put him at a disadvantage. Furthermore, he even brought out the words of helping a merchant. His table manners were a bit unsightly. However, things like standards always depended on the character. Even if the emperor wrote a limerick about a white dog swollen, the officials would still sing praises without restraint. After Fan Xian said this, all of the officials at the banquet stroked their beards and nodded. They deeply felt that Sir Fan Jr.'s words were simple but not simple. They were very reasonable. Fan Xian turned his head and looked at the official to his right. What does Minister Wei think? The present Minister of Revenue, Wei Dongheng, was a crafty official who had been polished for a long time in the Ministry of Revenue. In the past few years, he had gone to the Fan Manor to discuss matters with Minister Fan and had met Fan Xian countless times. For him to be able to take over Fan Xian's position was not only because of his performance in the Ministry of Revenue. More accurately, it was because he had completely fallen to the emperor's side. He wholeheartedly followed the emperor's wishes and pulled the Ministry of Revenue out of the swamp of the Fan family's independent kingdom. Minister Wei knew that his actions these 2 years had offended Sir Fan Jr. However, behind him was the emperor, so he was not too worried. During these 2 years, Fan Xian had not expressed any dissatisfaction toward him. It was as if he understood his difficulties. It was because of this that he knew of Fan Xian's arrival when the Sun Manor was hosting. After thinking for a long time, he still came. He had not expected that Sir Fan Jr. would actually choose to make things difficult for the Jingdo government and pick him first. His heart jumped slightly. He knew that Sir Fan Jr. did not like him. Otherwise, he would not have picked the Ministry of Revenue to be the first to attack. A faint coldness surged into his heart. However, Minister Wei had no other choice. After thinking for a moment, he smiled evenly and said, "What the Duke says is reasonable. The Ministry of Revenue acts according to the edict and Qing law. It would not act recklessly." Everyone at the banquet was a wily old fox who had risen and fallen in officialdom for a long time. They knew why Fan Xian had picked Minister Wei out to ask him alone. However, this matter did not concern them, so they had to let it go. They had not expected that Minister Wei's light words would push Fan Xian back. There was not even a vague promise of goodwill. The officials admired Minister Wei's courage. They were also worried about what would happen next. They all remained silent. The other 2 ministers raised their chopsticks and quietly indicated for the officials beside them to slowly eat. "I am a very peaceful person. The smile on Fan Xian's face grew brighter and brighter. Staring into Wei Donghang's eyes, he said evenly, "If there is an edict, I will act according to it. If there is no edict, I would like to see what will happen to those lowly people in the end." The Overwatch Council and the affairs of the court were two different things. They did not interfere with each other. Fan Xian's words had already crossed a taboo. The words, lowly people, had, without a doubt, shaved Minister Wei's face clean off. His expression immediately became icy. Looking at Fan Xian, he said, "What do you mean by this?" Fan Xian still did not get angry. He only smiled and said, "Nothing. I am just going into the palace tonight to ask the emperor what edict he has recently given the Ministry of Revenue for the Ministry of Revenue Yamen to not do their proper work and instead wait in the Jingdo government every day. I control the Overwatch Council, but I do not dare to privately investigate third-level officials and above." Fan Xian's expression remained warm. "Today is the old matriarch's 70th birthday, so I should not say such cold words that spoil the mood. However, I won't be able to stay in the capital for long. I am about to go to Dongyi. I also thought that the Jingdo government is an important matter, so I was in too much of a rush." Everyone, please don't laugh. The officials at the banquet all laughed dryly. No one dared to actually laugh. Sir Fan Jr.'s words had clearly reminded them that he was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. In 3 days, he would officially become the second director of the Qin Kingdom's Overwatch Council. As for his other identities, there was no need to mention them. Return to Dongyi? This was another reminder to the officials that Fan Xian had enough merit to ask the emperor for something, even if it was an edict. Minister Wei's heart jumped. He understood the meaning in these 2 sentences. Fan Xian raised a cup of wine and said to the officials at the banquet, "Everyone, let the Jingdo government be quieter." With these words, everyone knew that Fan Xian had officially stood out. After an awkward silence, people slowly raised the wine cups in front of them. It was uneven, but basically all of the officials raised their cups. Minister Wei was still staring at the wine cup in front of him in a daze. He was indeed in a difficult position. He knew that Fan Xian was a very vengeful person. Furthermore, he had smiled so warmly earlier. He was probably extremely angry in his heart. Even if he begged for mercy and took a step back, would Fan Xian let him go in the future? Furthermore, he was, after all, a minister of a court. His position was respectable, and he had the full support of the emperor and his own way. If he gave in like this, it would be difficult to justify. Fan Xian didn't look him in the eye. He smiled warmly and said, "Although we are all officials in court, we are all pitiful people. We all want to create a good future for our children, grandchildren, and relatives. The emperor once said that in life, one must have a heart of reverence." He looked at the people at the banquet and warmly said, "As I walk between heaven and earth, I only have a heart of reverence for 2 things. The minister of the Board of Rights furrowed his brows slightly. He had been the first person to raise his cup earlier. He was different from Minister Wei. He had not offended the Fan manor, so he had a chance to make amends. Furthermore, he silently mocked Wei Dongxing for not knowing what kind of person Sir Fan Jr. was and what tricks he had. He knew what Minister Wei was thinking. The Overwatch Council could not control officials above the 3rd level. As long as the emperor did not speak, it seemed that Sir Fan Jr. could not threaten him at all. However, he knew that Minister Wei seemed to have forgotten history. When Fan Xian was still a commoner, he had sent the original minister of the Board of Rights, Guiyu, to his death. Later, he had destroyed countless ministers. This was a ruthless person who dared to force the crown prince to his death. Why would you, a mere minister, clash head-on with him? Thinking of this, the minister of the Board of Rights followed Fan Xian's words and asked with a smile, "What is your reverence for?" "I first salute the emperor, and second salute my parents." Fan Xian gently spun the little wine cup between his fingers and smiled. "The emperor speaks well. Without a heart of reverence, one's actions will tend to be impetuous. In the past, my actions have been impetuous. Please, everyone, forgive me. There was another wave of laughter at the banquet. Everyone heard the meaning of these words clearly. Reverence? The Duke was clearly telling everyone that other than heaven and earth, parents, and the Emperor, in their reverence, they should not forget themselves. Impetuous? This Duke's actions were not only impetuous, they were sinister and ruthless. It was still that old saying. It was a very low-level threat. Because the person making the threat was too powerful, it appeared powerful. In particular, Fan Xian's earlier mention of children and relatives finally reminded some people that even if the Overwatch Council could not touch the ministers and vice-ministers, it was an easy matter to send the rest of the people and their families to hell. This was a very arrogant, and impudent action. However, the Emperor favored and trusted Fan Xian. No one could change this reality. Wei Dongxing's expression gradually darkened. His fingers also began to tremble. He felt that Sir Fan Jr. was too unreasonable. Did he dare to act against his own family because of his own matters? Everyone knew that Fan Xian dared. Although Sir Fan Jr. had the title of an immortal poet, he had always walked the dark and ghostly path and was used to being unreasonable. In the end, Wei Dongxing slowly raised his wine cup and drained it in one gulp. He didn't know the taste of the wine. Fan Xian nodded and raised his wine cup again. He said one last thing, everyone, eat and drink well. He didn't know if the remaining officials, particularly the Minister of Revenue who had been openly threatened and disdained by Fan Xian, were in the mood to eat and drink well. In any case, Fan Xian was in a good mood. He left the Sun Manor early and didn't go home with Lin Wanner. Instead, he sat in the black carriage and headed toward the north of the city. To the Imperial College, he ordered Mu Feng'er. Who the scholar is not on duty today. He is giving a lecture in the Imperial College. Mu Feng'er made a sound of acknowledgement and didn't think about why he was in such a rush to see who the scholar. Fan Xian rubbed the slightly tightened space between his brows in the carriage. His actions in the Sun Manor were not appropriate, but he had to put on such an attitude. Such an attitude would immediately spread throughout Jingdo, so he had to be at the very front to deal with the follow-up matters. He was going to enter the palace at night. Before entering the palace, he had to see who the scholar. If he could convince this leading scholar, then he would have more confidence in challenging the emperor. Chapter 660. The black carriage passed by the intersection of Dongchuan. Fan Xian had just pulled back his gaze from his bookstore and medical shop. Turning his head, he saw the ancient, overflowing doors of the Imperial College. The Imperial College was a rather sparsely built group of buildings. There were no buildings such as yamen or halls facing the street, and there were no tall courtyard walls. Even the main gate had never been closed. The green trees inside poked out, and the sounds of reading could be heard everywhere. It was full of the quiet and peaceful atmosphere of Confucianism. Just as the Bureau of Military Affairs had once been called the Ministry of Military Affairs, the old Ministry of Military Affairs was still mixed in with the Ministry of War of the Six Ministries. The Qing Kingdom had played with a number of new policies over the past few decades, and they had changed the name of the Imperial College again and again. Tunguen Library, Institute of Education. Whatever was difficult to say, the emperor had randomly changed it. However, the scholars of the world were still used to calling this area the Imperial College. Later, the official documents of the court naturally acknowledged this. The scholars selected by each province, as well as the outstanding children pushed out by the manners of the nobility in Jingdo, were all gathered in this group of buildings to study classics, history, and the ways of governance. This was the highest school in the Qing Kingdom, so the teachers they invited were also the best of the best. For example, Sir Pan Ling, who had already become a master calligrapher in the palace, and Seng Wenxiang, the teacher of He Zongwei, a scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. A few years ago, Xu the scholar had also been a professor at the Imperial College. Now, the #1 Chinese official in the court, Hu the scholar, also often came to the Imperial College to teach these scholars. With so many arrogant teachers, in addition to the special status of the Imperial College, the students inside already had a very good future. So, the students of the Imperial College could not help but be arrogant. Normal government offices did not want to interact with the Imperial College, and the Qing Kingdom's slightly more liberal style of learning made it even more difficult for normal officials to casually go in. They were very afraid of being interrogated by these students and then fleeing in a sorry state. However, Fan Xian had never had such worries. His relationship with the students of the Imperial College had always been good. Particularly after the 4th year of the Qing calendar, he held a position in the Imperial College and served as the assistant of the nominal head of the Imperial College. Later, Fan Xian's talent shocked the world and he dragged a carriage full of Master Zhuang's books from northern Qi back to the Imperial College. His position in the Imperial College became incomparably high, and he was deeply respected by the students. The carriage quietly stopped at the gate of the Imperial College. An official had already come to receive them. Fan Xian got off the carriage and raised his head to look at the large door he hadn't seen in half a year. He smiled. This simple and unadorned door had actually been built later. It had forcefully rubbed in a bit of antiquity. Spending so much silver was actually because the Qing kingdom always had a deep sense of inferiority when it came to learning, particularly in certain corners related to history. The sky suddenly began to rain. Although it was not heavy, the scattered raindrops fell on the dark wooden door of the Imperial College, making it particularly eye-catching. The mottled spots gradually became a blur, and the stone slabs on the ground were about to accumulate water. An official from the Qinian unit silently took out a robe from the carriage and wanted to help him put it on. Fan Xian shook his head. Although he liked to wear black robes and bring his closest subordinates in a triangular formation and move out like a ghost in Jingdo's quiet autumn night, he didn't want to appear too special and startle the hot-blooded and pure students. Mu Feng held up an umbrella and sent him through the gates of the Imperial College. It was already afternoon. The sun had already moved west. Now, it was covered by clouds and swept away by the dark rain. The light became even dimmer. The spacious courtyard was filled with a sense of seclusion. Walking forward under the green trees, he didn't see a single person. It was extremely empty and quiet. Thousands of Imperial College students were still in class. As a professor, Fan Xian counted clearly. However, he furrowed his brows and thought, why did the sound of reading stop so uniformly? Like a swarm of bees suddenly moving together or like a mountain wind pouring into a narrow natural stone kettle, a buzzing sound suddenly rang out in the quiet courtyard of the Imperial College. The sound grew closer and louder. It was the sound of countless people talking and laughing mixed together. Class ended. Hundreds of young scholars walked out of the various courtyards of the Imperial College at the same time and walked to the wide path in the center. They were densely packed and squeezed together. A wave of fresh energy immediately filled the entire space. Some of the young people had forgotten to bring umbrellas. They cried out loudly and jumped on the wet stone pavement. Breaking through the layers of rain, they ran toward their own dorms. Most of the students were calm and unruffled in the midst of chaos. With calm smiles, they opened the umbrellas beside them. For a moment, the entire courtyard was filled with countless umbrellas of all different colors. However, there were no bright colors. Most of them were light green and gray. Thus, Fan Xian, who originally didn't want to stand out, became a strange plant in the sea of pale umbrellas because of the large black umbrella above his head. He immediately attracted everyone's attention. Sir Fan Jr. Teacher. Sir. The students surrounded him in pleasant surprise and bowed to Fan Xian. Most of the students had only seen his appearance from a distance. Some had been fortunate enough to have followed him to edit Master Zhuang's classics and history books, so they shouted with particular strength. Fortunately, there was no congestion. These students probably knew that Fan Xian was busy with official business in court and had recently been busy with important matters in Dongyi. Thus, they all suppressed the joy in their hearts. After bowing and greeting him, they made way for the middle path. Fan Xian smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. He then chatted a bit with familiar students and teachers before raising his head to look at the color of the sky. He didn't dare tarry any longer. Excusing himself, he walked toward the depths of Jingxi courtyard. Behind him and the Overwatch Council officials, the students of the Imperial College still found it difficult to suppress their excitement. They whispered curiously among themselves. They were all guessing why Sir Fan Jr. had come to the Imperial College today. Would the Emperor return Sir Fan Jr. to the Imperial College just because of the Dongyi matter? Would he be allowed to continue teaching? Fan Xian closed the black umbrella and placed it by the door. A stream of cool rainwater flowed down the tip of the umbrella and wrote a large character, drenching the tall wooden doorframe. Fan Xian accepted the towel the teacher handed him and carelessly wiped his slightly wet hair. He then entered the inner room and bowed to the scholar behind the desk. With a smile, he said, "I've come to see you." The scholar took off the glasses on his nose and looked at him suspiciously for a while before recognizing him. He smiled and said, "It's rare that I don't have to stay in the corner room today. I was just thinking about some peace and quiet. Can't you give me some time to relax?" Presently, the Hall of Governmental Affairs was headed by the scholar. The emperor was, after all, gradually getting older. His energy was not as great as when he was in his prime. Furthermore, the emperor seemed to have thought things through and had thrown many political matters to the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He no longer had to attend to everything personally. In this way, the power of the Hall of Governmental Affairs was greater, but its affairs were incredibly busy. Using the private words of some sharp-eyed officials, the present Hall of Governmental Affairs was gradually becoming the Prime Minister's manor of the past. The power in the hands of the head scholar, the scholar, also seemed to be moving closer and closer to that of the past Lin Ruofu. Fan Xian didn't believe this. Since the emperor had, with great difficulty, pulled his father-in-law off the stage, he would not allow another Lin Ruofu to appear. However, he also knew that the scholar worked hard on political matters all day and was indeed very tired. Smiling, he went forward and bowed again. "If it wasn't serious business, I wouldn't have come to bother you." The scholar had a good relationship with him. One reason was that in the debate between the old and the new, the two of them were on the same side. Both sides admired each other's temperament, so they had formed a good personal relationship. Another reason was that during the Jingdo Rebellion, the scholar had helped Fan Xian greatly. In the end, Fan Xian had been the first to save his life. "Speak." The scholar placed the glasses on the table with a light click. After a slight pause, he sighed and said, "For you to personally go, I don't think it will be a good thing." Fan Xian smiled and looked at the glasses on the table. He didn't immediately speak of his purpose of coming. Instead, he said, "Are these crystal glasses still useful?" Just like in the past, the scholar had a youthful appearance that did not match his age at all. However, Fan Xian knew that there was a small problem with the eyes of this head of civil officials. 2 years ago, they had occasionally talked about it and Fan Xian had remembered it. He had the palace treasury ponder it for a long time. In the end, they had found a foreign crystal from Dongyi and made a pair of unique glasses for him. The scholar had always been grateful for this matter. Day and night, he worked on government affairs and examined memorials. If his eyes were not good, it would be a big problem. However, it was hand-ground and there was no optometry machine. Fan Xian only knew that the scholar had presbyopia. He didn't know how much help it would be. Very good," the scholar said with a smile. The scholar smiled and said, "Fine, just based on this bespectacled boy's affection, I will do whatever you want. In any case, the little duke will not have me do anything stupid that goes against the law and goes against the edict." After these words were said, Fan Xian was speechless and almost broke into laughter. He thought that this scholar appeared righteous, but he was actually so cautious and cunning. The two of them knew that, given Fan Xian's abilities, if there was a problem he could not handle himself, it had to be a problem within the court. Who the scholar's words were extremely cunning. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. Just as Who the scholar thought that it would be difficult for him to speak and was stroking his beard to comfort himself, he suddenly narrowed his eyes and said, "The Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, is a pretty good official." Who the scholar's fingers tightened and almost pulled out his beard. He coughed repeatedly. He truly had not expected Fan Xian to speak so directly. Concerning the position of the Jingdo magistrate, as the leader of the civil officials, he knew the cause of the current situation. However, the emperor was currently supporting He Zongwei to the position, so as a scholar, he could only maintain his silence. He glanced at Fan Xian probingly and said, "Sir Sun, was it not the Duke who personally suppressed the rumors back then?" Fan Xian couldn't be bothered to beat around the bush with him. He directly sat down beside him and moved close to his ear. "I have nothing to do with his daughter, but I do want to protect Sir Sunday. This is the emperor's intention." Who the scholar did not hold back on anything in front of him and directly brought up the emperor. Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "It is just that He Zongwei is dancing there in a youthful and moving manner." "What does that have to do with the emperor?" Who the scholar smiled. He knew that in front of anyone, this kid would not admit that the problem with the Jingdo government was the emperor's intention. Otherwise, he would be openly challenging the emperor. Fan Xian continued, "I only ask one thing. How exactly was Sun Jingxiu's performance these 3 years?" "This." Who the scholar gently stroked his short beard. After a moment of silence, he said, "Above average for 2 years and average for 1 year. It was nothing more than average." The Jingdo government was indeed an important position. Thus, Who the scholar firmly remembered the performance of the 3 years and blurted it out. Fan Xian laughed coldly and said, "Don't say these blind words. The scholar knows in his heart that the position of Jingdo magistrate is not for people. If you don't offend this manner, then you offend that department. Year after year, you fail every year." Back then, Meijili was at most average. Fan Xian rubbed his wrist and said, "Sun Jingxiu had 2 years of being above average. He was already an extraordinary and capable official. Additionally, this person was not good at forming factions and cheating. For him to have such an evaluation is truly rare." Who the scholar was silent for a moment. In the end, he could not defeat his own conscience and principles. Gently, he nodded his head. He knew that the position of the Jingdo magistrate was difficult to handle. Sun Jingxiu was truly a rare subordinate. If he continued to be in charge of the Jingdo government, it would be much easier for him as a scholar to handle matters. If he is truly removed, who will replace him? Fan Xian said seriously. "I have not come today for personal feelings or to fight. I just want to ask, does the scholar want to see the Jingdo government change through another 5 magistrates in the next 3 years and, in the end, cause such a ruckus that no one will dare to come and even play the trick of eating coal and getting sick?" Who the scholar sighed and said awkwardly, "I also don't want Sir Sun to leave. However, I still don't understand why there would be rumors of this coming from the palace." He stared into Fan Xian's eyes and quietly asked, "Did you and that person quarrel again?" In this world, the only person who dared to quarrel with the emperor was Fan Xian. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly and said, "It has nothing to do with quarreling. You should also see clearly that the emperor is using this matter to establish He Zongwei's might. Not to mention that Sun Jingxiu is now my man. Even if he was an idiot, I would still protect him. Earlier, you said it was not personal feelings. Now, he is your man again." Who the scholar smiled bitterly and shook his head. "What do you want me to do? If I appear, the emperor will certainly guess that I was asked by you. Sir, he is also a talented person. Why do you have to be angry at him?" Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then quietly said, "This anger must be dealt with. In this world, if the east wind does not overwhelm the west wind, then the west wind will overwhelm the east wind. I will not give Hizongwei a glimmer of hope, a glimmer of possibility, a sliver of luck, or a successful history." Why? Hu the scholar saw the seriousness in his words and felt slightly startled. Fan Xian didn't answer this question because it involved him doing his best to hold on to the power in his hands under the emperor's pressure and make an announcement. He slowly stood and said, "Tonight, I am going to the palace to quarrel and force the emperor not to issue an edict." Thus, the Jingdo government's problem is the pressure of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. I need you to help me resist it. Hu the scholar didn't reply. It was as if he was waiting for his explanation. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, "Sun Jingxiu is a decent official. He shouldn't disappear in the senseless struggle for power. The reason is actually that simple." Without waiting for Hu the scholar to speak, he faintly said, "The Imperial College is a decent place. It is full of youthful energy. These students will all enter the court to become officials. As teachers, not only do we have to teach them something, we also have to use the true situation in court to help them build up some confidence. As long as an official is willing to do things, he will be safe and sound." Fan Xian stared into Hu the scholar's eyes. "If Sun Jingxiu collapses like this, what will you teach these students? What use will the standards in the scholar's books have?" Forced into a corner by Fan Xian, Hu the scholar was silent for a long time. He knew that this little duke was someone who would do what he said. If he didn't agree, he might actually use his prestige in the Imperial College to incite the students to do something. He couldn't help but sigh and say, "Fine, as long as the emperor does not issue an edict, I will protect Sir Sunday." Hearing these words, Fan Xian finally smiled happily and raised his hands in a salute. Without saying anything more, he bid farewell and left. Hu the scholar picked up the crystal spectacles on the table and said with a smile, "Even if it's to return the favor for these spectacles, don't you think I'm returning the favor a bit too much?" Fan Xian was in a good mood. "At worst, I'll have the palace treasury make a few more pairs and give one to each of your young masters." Hu the scholar was secretly mocked by him and laughingly scolded, "What I mean is, the governor said a few days ago that when you finish with the Dongyi matter, you have to hurry back to the Imperial College to teach the students." Fan Xian smiled and replied, "Even if you didn't say this, I was prepared to do it." These were sincere words. Entering the Imperial College and seeing so many young students, Fan Xian was in a good mood. It was as if he thought of his previous life when he was in school. Furthermore, he knew that these students would certainly be the pillars of the Qin kingdom in the future. If he could influence them a little ahead of time, at some point, perhaps this would be his life-saving talisman. Fan Xian bid farewell and left. Hu the scholar continued to do his own things alone under the dim company of the light. After an indeterminable amount of time, before the sky had completely darkened, an official quietly walked in and said something by his ear. Hu the scholar was silent for a long time. A bitter smile rose involuntarily to the corners of his lips. In a quiet voice, he said, "So, something like this happened at the Sun Manor banquet. I really don't know what this little duke is thinking to make such a pompous fuss. It is completely unlike his usual reserved personality." The official was Hu the scholar's trusted aide. There was also a puzzled expression on his face. He said with confusion, "Furthermore, this matter is very strange. He clearly knows that it is the palace's intention, yet Sir Fan Jr. is still stubbornly resisting it and even begging teacher. For a mere Sun Jingxiu, is it worth it? It's not just Sun Jingxiu." Hu the scholar sighed again and waved his hand for the official to leave. He warned, "There's no need to bring this matter up again. As long as the emperor does not issue an edict, I will protect someone for Sir Fan Jr. It should be fine." The official acknowledged in a low voice and left after saying his goodbyes. Hu the scholar's still young face changed expression under the dim light. He was thinking about Fan Xian's words earlier and guessing at Fan Xian's true intentions. East wind and west wind? He rubbed his slightly tightened brows and couldn't resist smiling bitterly. Sir, he probably did not have the right to be the east wind. Sir Fan Jr. was fighting the emperor. But, why was he fighting? Was it because he had a grudge against the emperor's action of reducing power and was venting it here? The scholar sank into deep thought. He kept feeling that this was not the case. It had already been 3 years. The emperor's reduction of the Overwatch Council's power had continued to advance. Fan Xian always took a step back before the palace took another step forward. He followed suit and retreated without a trace of unwillingness. Why didn't Fan Xian retreat? Was he worried that if he retreated too much, he wouldn't have anything in his hands to contend with others? Other than the emperor, who did he need to contend with? The scholar's brows were furrowed tightly. He could not understand this matter no matter what. Suddenly, his fingers touched his wrinkles. Startled, he quickly and slowly used his fingers to spread them apart. Then, he quietly took out a small porcelain bottle from under the table. He picked out a small oily substance from the bottle and carefully smeared it on his face. After slowly patting it, the skin on his face became smoother. The few wrinkles were not eye-catching at all. The scholar put the porcelain bottle into the table and hid it well. He smiled self-mockingly. There was no need for him to think so much about the matters between the emperor and his son. It was not like they could truly turn hostile. Instead, it was his own face that made the self-mockery at the corners of the scholar's lips grow stronger. There was even a faint sorrow. He was not young, so he paid particular attention to the care of his face. He knew that his historical mission was to become the center of the emperor's court in 100 years, so he had to not appear old. If His Majesty thought that he was already old, he would definitely have other ideas and leave a younger minister to assist his son. Everyone had their own secrets, their own helplessness, and their own sorrow. Yesterday's chapter was liked by many people. I was pleasantly surprised. Today's chapter is one that I've liked recently. I don't have any sense of anxiety when writing it. I am very satisfied. At the beginning of the month, I summon the monthly votes to everyone. Last month, everyone has worked hard. I will continue to trouble you this month. Come, vote for me. Chapter 661. 3 years ago, the entire Jingdo was hunting me down. If it weren't for the help of the Sun family, it would have been difficult for me to live until now, much less transport the Black Knights into the capital. The atmosphere in the royal study was tense. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and looked at the emperor on the couch in front of him. His expression was slightly heavy as he slowly said each word. From this perspective, the Sun family can be considered my savior and a meritorious minister in quelling the rebellion. Quelling the rebellion? The emperor did not raise his head. The dim yellow light shone on his tightly bound hair. A few strands of white hair could faintly be seen reflected. He only continued Fan Xian's words and coldly said, "If I remember correctly, that was the work of the young lady of the Sun family. What does it have to do with her father? The young lady of the Sun family was always her father's child." Fan Xian raised his head and looked at the emperor stubbornly and calmly. The emperor put down the file in his hand and also raised his head. He looked calmly at his son and was silent for a long time. It was as if he wanted to see the true thoughts in the depths of his heart. A moment later, he quietly said, "You came to the palace today to say this?" "Yes, Your Majesty." The emperor once again fell silent. After a long time, he suddenly said, "Why? I am a person who always returns favors and grudges." The reason Fan Xian gave was simple. "I am greatly indebted to the young lady of the Sun family. If you only want to repay the favor." The emperor said mockingly, "I gave Sun Pin, to you. Naturally, Sun Jingxiu's face will be bright. Why fight for this position?" Fan Xian did not smile in embarrassment. His face was incomparably calm, but his heart tightened slightly. Gritting his teeth, he said through his teeth, "Because you promised me 3 years ago." The emperor sank into silence. 3 years ago, Fan Xian had asked him for credit. Among them was the matter of Sun Jingxiu. He slowly opened his mouth and said, "What in this world never changes? The position of an official is the foundation of a country. How can it never change because of one word? Based on your words, if I promise you something, even if that person is corrupt and breaks the law in the future, I will still follow you and not touch him?" Fan Xian's earlier words carried a glimmer of anger and a glimmer of unbecoming ferocity. The emperor was angered by this intention of using his achievements to ask for rewards. In an instant, he calmed down. Perhaps the emperor liked Fan Xian's personality of putting everything on the table to argue. Sun Jingxiu is a capable official. Fan Xian did not take a step back. Looking at the emperor's face, he said in a clear voice, "If he dares to take bribes and bend the law, I will be the first to capture him and hack him to pieces." A strange light flashed through the emperor's eyes. It was as if he had not thought that Fan Xian would care so much about this matter. He faintly thought that it was probably because the method of reducing power had come too quickly and pierced this young man's heart. The Dongyi matter was still being dealt with. The court had not truly rewarded Ji for his service, yet they were in a rush to arrange an opponent for him in court. No wonder Ji felt uncomfortable and forcefully pushed back. The emperor smiled slightly, thinking he understood Fan Xian's thoughts. He shook his head and didn't continue on the matter. A routine performance appraisal will always have to be done. The emperor lowered his head and said evenly. "Since you want to repay Sun Jingxiu's kindness in the past, I will not force you to be an unjust person. However, if he is not suitable to continue in this position, I will replace him." The emperor raised his head. It seemed to be a warning and also a reminder. Even if you are the director of the Overwatch Council, you cannot interfere too much with the matters of the court. The students of the Hall of Governmental Affairs work hard on court affairs. Don't interfere too much. Fan Xian didn't say anything more. He lowered his body in a bow and left the royal study. In these last 2 sentences, the emperor had already expressed very clearly that he would not personally interfere in this matter. However, He Zongwei would still act against Sun Jingxiu. Furthermore, he reminded Fan Xian not to make any secret moves against He Zongwei. Otherwise, the emperor would truly be angry. After Fan Xian left, the emperor glanced helplessly at the files on the table. A faint annoyance rose in his heart. With one hand, he pushed the files away and sat alone in the royal study. No one knew what he was thinking. Everything about Ji is good. It's just that his personality is too direct and stubborn. As the emperor thought to himself, he summoned eunuch Yao in and asked him about what had happened in Jingdo. His expression gradually calmed. Hearing about the matter of the birthday banquet in Sun Manor, the emperor thought deeply for a long time. He understood why Fan Xian had jumped up like an old cat whose tail had been stepped on. An official who had just performed a great service was about to have his power reduced and his face swept away. Perhaps anyone would feel angry, let alone Fan Xian. Perhaps this matter was a bit too rushed, the emperor thought to himself. He did not want to admit that he had overlooked something. Coldly, he said to eunuch Yao, "Tell He Zongwei to do as he pleases. As for Ji, don't worry about it for now." The emperor had not thought that Fan Xian's anger was mostly faked. He only wanted to use his anger and sadness to force the emperor's heart to be moved and unable to bear to bully him. He wanted to keep the power in his hands for a while longer. Eunuch Yao respectfully responded. Immediately after, he lowered his voice and said, "That matter has been investigated to its end." The emperor made a sound of acknowledgement. A cold light flashed through his eyes as he said, "Speak." The dispatch order from the third workshop and the order for the city guarding crossbows to leave North Min have both been obtained. However, when we finally found the transfer order from the Bureau of Military Affairs, it pointed to the Qin family. We couldn't see a shadow of that side, Eunuch Yao said in a trembling voice. The internal court had been secretly investigating the attack in the valley for the past year. The emperor had never let go of the suspicions from back then. He wholeheartedly wanted to capture that person and comfort Sir Fan Jr. To be able to do so many things without a sound and to have his hands and feet probed into the palace treasury was something that even the Qin family, once a member of the military, could not do. Furthermore, he did not leave behind any clues after the matter. In the entire Qin kingdom, other than the emperor himself, there were only the people of the Overwatch Council. The emperor's expression was complicated. He was a very vengeful and sensitive person. Presently, the situation under heaven could be anticipated. Although there were some small problems within the court, there was nothing that could threaten the foundation of the Li family's rule. Thus, the attack in the valley had become a thorn in his heart. Not only because someone had almost killed his son, but also because he had discovered that that person had faintly broken away from his control. Just like Fan Xian now, it seemed that he was also showing signs of breaking away from his control. As for Fan Xian, he could temporarily tolerate him because he was his own son, his most beloved son, and the son who had done the most for the Qin kingdom. As for that person had done even more for the Qin kingdom. Furthermore, the emperor still had not figured out the reason. He sat tiredly on the soft couch as if he didn't want to continue thinking about this matter. After a long silence, he said, "The investigation of the valley ends here. In any case, they are all people who are about to die. Have you found out the person behind the two eunuchs?" Eunuch Yao's temples burned with pain. He shook his head in fear. He knew who the two eunuchs the emperor was talking about were. This was another mystery behind the fog of the Qin kingdom. At the time, under the Empress Dowager's leadership, the entire Qin royal family was moving toward the crown prince's ascension. The second prince had also temporarily maintained peace with the crown prince. Coincidentally, two eunuchs jumped out of the palace with the intention of assassinating the third prince, Li Qingping. What exactly did they want to do? Furthermore, under the circumstances at the time, the third prince's life and death had no intrinsic effect on the crown prince's ascension. On the contrary, if the third prince had died tragically in the palace, it would have been an infamy that the crown prince and the second prince could not bear. Afterward, Fan Xian had investigated carefully, but the crown prince and the second prince did not admit to it. The eldest princess did not even talk about such a small matter before her death. Fan Xian could not continue investigating. He could only think that there were too many variables in the palace at that time. He didn't know what kind of conflict had exploded to put the third prince in danger. However, the emperor did not think this way. He never let go of any of the smallest oddities. That was why he was able to accomplish such a grand undertaking. Fan Xian walked out of the royal palace in the dark and ignored the eunuchs and serving girls who bowed humbly around him. He flicked his sleeves and left with a dark expression. When it came to his attitude toward servants, Fan Xian was definitely an anomaly in the Qin kingdom. Putting aside the servants and serving girls in the Fan manor, even toward the eunuchs and serving girls in the palace, his words were always gentle. Not only was he generous, but his attitude was also very different. It was as if he never thought there was anything to hate about these abnormal people. Because of this, the people in the royal palace all had a heartfelt respect and love for this little duke. Although Eunuch Ho, who had died to the arrows of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council 3 years ago, was someone the eldest princess had secretly planted, he was usually full of praise for Fan Xian. Fan Xian's unusual behavior fell into the eyes of many people. This behavior was very different from his usual behavior. These eunuchs and serving girls all felt a glimmer of strangeness. They all guessed that the little duke was probably arguing with the emperor in the royal study again. Walking out of the dark and secluded palace gate, Fan Xian stood on the square in front of the royal palace. He didn't turn his head to look at the palace gate. Instead, he spread his arms and let out a loud cry. It was as if he wanted to vent all the depression in his chest with this cry. His voice echoed through the silent and empty square. It crashed against the red wall of the royal palace and then turned back. It lingered for a long time without stopping. The guards inside the palace gate, the imperial soldiers outside, and the eunuchs who were about to drop the key all turned their gazes toward him. They were all startled by this voice. If it had been a normal person yelling like this at the palace gate, the imperial soldiers would probably have long rushed forward and given him a good beating. Then, they would be sent to the celestial prison to wait for the fall beheading for the crime of disturbing the palace. However, no one dared to move even after Fan Xian's random yell. There wasn't even a verbal reminder. Even if this person had gone crazy, if he was Fan Xian, then everyone would only beautify it as the madness of a poet and turn a blind eye to it. The person on duty at the palace gate was the commander of the imperial army, Gong Dian. He was the first official Fan Xian had seen after entering the capital. The two of them could be considered to be familiar. Hearing this cry, Gong Dian ran out from the duty room and hurried over. Dragging him back, he said, "What's wrong with you?" Fan Xian tidied the sleeves on his arm and smiled coldly. "I'm really about to go crazy." Although he said this, his expression had already calmed a great deal. Earlier, he indeed had some anger that needed to be vented. After enduring in this world until now, in front of everyone, Fan Xian no longer needed to hide anything or go against his nature. Other than the emperor, acting in front of the emperor was indeed very stressful. Furthermore, his emotions were very complicated. Looking at the emperor's thin and tired face, for some reason, Fan Xian thought of the portrait in the little building and the story from many years ago. A wave of blood and fire gathered in Fan Xian's eyes. He found it difficult to bear the feeling of being torn apart by these mixed feelings. Even though he was yelling in front of the palace gate, Fan Xian was actually acting. He knew that before long, this yell would be reported to the emperor's ears in the royal study. He wanted to act like a real person, an angry and wronged illegitimate child. It was very tiring. He didn't want to act anymore. "Accompany me to drink." He stared at Gong Dian like a refugee staring at a piece of pork belly. "I'll seal up Baoyue brothel and call 60 girls to accompany you." Truly, truly crazy. Gong Dian's eyes were bright and full of expression as he stared back at him. He placed a hand on his forehead. There was a manor by the side of Xinhuai Alley. This residence did not take up a large amount of space. The overhanging eaves and walls were not very magnificent. Its location was also not very good. It intersected with the surrounding private residences and was not very different. This manor belonged to an old imperial censor of the previous dynasty. After this old imperial censor retired and returned to his hometown, the residence was left empty and handed to a few old colleagues to manage. Thinking that it would be more convenient for his descendants when they sought a future in Jingdo, he had no intention of selling it. 3 years ago, this manor was still sold. From then on, the quiet Xinhuai Alley became lively. Occasionally, officials would come to visit. During the New Year and other festivals, the crowd at the entrance was like a dragon. It was extraordinarily lively. Following the gradual promotion of the new master of the imperial censor's manor, there were fewer and fewer officials who came to visit because the new master's incorruptible reputation gradually spread. No one wanted to touch his bad luck. The imperial censor of the left, the traveling scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, Hizongwei, was the new master of this imperial censor's manor. In reality, his colleagues had all advised against it. Even the emperor had once mentioned that most of the officials lived in the south of the city. It was inconvenient for Hizongwei to live in the old imperial censor's manor in Xinhuai Alley. Furthermore, it did not match the dignity of a court official. Scholar he, who was in the same light as the dust in court matters, deeply understood the samadhi of officialdom, and was greatly appreciated by the emperor and admired by his colleagues, was very insistent on this matter. He even refused the emperor's edict to bestow him a residence. He still brought his 2 or 3 loyal servants, a widowed aunt, and a few distant brothers to live in this old imperial censor's manor. He lived there for 3 years. He Zongwei pushed open the door and walked into the somewhat dilapidated courtyard of the old imperial censor's manor. Looking at the messy spring scenery and the green leaves scattered everywhere, he couldn't help but shake his head self-mockingly. The reason he had always lived in this old imperial censor's manor was because he had feelings for it. Furthermore, this manor represented many important meanings to his life. The first time He Zongwei truly stepped onto the stage of the Qin kingdom was when Prime Minister Lin Ruofu resigned from his post 5 years ago. He Zongwei, coincidentally, met the wife of the Prime Minister's strategist, Wu Bo-en. Feeling indignant, he went to the imperial censor to file a complaint against the emperor. He then, coincidentally, met the Prime Minister's killer. He then, coincidentally, met the second prince and the heir, Li Hongcheng. After a series of coincidences, he coincidentally followed the general trend of the Qin court at the time and forcefully brought down Prime Minister Lin Ruofu. He Zongwei, who had missed the spring examinations because he was in mourning, was still a commoner. In everyone's eyes, he had brought down a treacherous prime minister with the strength of an ordinary man. At that moment, his reputation rose. In the hearts of scholars, no one saw him as just a Jingdo talent on par with Hou Jichang. Instead, they saw him as a remarkable figure with great ambition and a determined temperament. It was also through the incident of Prime Minister Lin's fall that He Zongwei was able to see the emperor's face for the first time. From that day on, he was deeply convinced by the emperor's bearing and schemes. It was also that day that the emperor also took a fancy to this young scholar. With an imperial edict, he had him enter the imperial censor and become an imperial censor. In the following years, He Zongwei dealt with various powers and finally successfully ascended. He became the youngest scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs in the history of the Qin kingdom. His limelight flourished and was unparalleled. Of course, that was because no one would compare him to that person. Even though he was scholar, in the hearts of thousands of people in the Qin kingdom, that person would forever be the only one, the high and lofty one. In He Zongwei's heart, that person was a shadow. This shadow floated above his head and blocked out the limitless light of his life, leaving only a patch of darkness and coldness. That shadow was Fan Xian. When He Zongwei received the unanimous praise of the scholars because of Prime Minister Lin's matter, Fan Xian had already exposed the scandal of the spring examination and made 15 officials of the court, including the Minister of the Board of Rights, dead people. Furthermore, there was also the poem that night in front of the palace. When He Zongwei was still a common imperial censor in the imperial censor, Fan Xian was already the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. He had forced the emperor to beat the imperial censors in front of the royal palace. Those imperial censors were He Zongwei's seniors and superiors. When He Zongwei finally welcomed the most glorious moment of his life, Fan Xian still only looked at him with disdain. With one hand he held the Overwatch Council, with the other he held the palace treasury. Now, he had seized back a large piece of land for the Qin kingdom, Dongyi. He was a talent, and the other was an immortal poet. He was a scholar, and the other was the Duke of Danbo. Most importantly, he was just a poor child of a poor family, and the other was the emperor's illegitimate child. No matter when, no matter where, Fan Xian firmly pressed down on him until he almost couldn't breathe. He Zongwei looked at the spring garden in front of him. He looked at the messy grass growing without anyone taking care of it and sank into silence. He knew that in this life, no matter how hard he worked, he would never be able to surpass that person. He Zongwei slowly closed his eyes and sighed helplessly. He had great confidence in his abilities and willpower. He didn't think he was any worse than Fan Xian. However, fate had long decided this. What could he do? He heard that Sir Yen Jr. of the Overwatch Council kept a few vicious dogs at home, forcing no court officials to visit. He also heard that Fan Xian kept countless guards at home. If anyone shamelessly came to give gifts, they would all be chased out of the manor. He Zongwei's manor couldn't afford to keep dogs or people, but it had raised a black face. In order to maintain his impartial and incorruptible image, He Zongwei had paid a great price. Furthermore, he could not be as unreasonable as the two people in the Overwatch Council. He had to reject bribes and also not make the other party feel uncomfortable. Thus, He Zongwei was also very tired. At least, he thought he was much more tired than Fan Xian. The salary of court officials was not much. It was only 1/3 of the salary of officials of the same rank in the Overwatch Council. Additionally, He Zongwei had a reputation for being incorruptible, so it was difficult to maintain the manor's expenses. Although the emperor knew of his family's poverty and had the internal court bestow a great deal of gold and silver, traveling to and from Jingdo was always too expensive. What He Zongwei worried about the most was not Sun Jingxiu of the Jingdo government but whether or not he should spend money to repair the garden. He Zongwei let out a bitter laugh. Who knew how much he had sacrificed for the sake of such glory? He was not like Fan Xian, who had a large palace treasury to support and a bookstore and brothel to support him. Strangely, the harder his life was, the calmer He Zongwei's expression was and the happier he felt. It was as if there was a kind of painful torture that could make him truly understand the meaning of his existence. He wanted to do great things for the court. He wanted to become a truly famous official. He Zongwei's eyes grew brighter and brighter. Looking at the chaotic spring garden in the night, he didn't say a word. He only thought to himself, Fan Xian had indeed gone to the Sun Manor today. When the Hall of Governmental Affairs discussed matters tomorrow, what kind of attitude should I have? Earlier, the eunuch in the palace had brought the emperor's verbal edict. It had made his heart more at ease, but it had also made it more depressing. I have to find another way. He Zongwei lowered his head in the night wind. What great things! What famous official! Under Fan Xian's pressure, he had to first ensure that he could continue living after the emperor died. Thus, before the emperor died, he had to let Fan Xian die first. Chapter 662. It rained intermittently during the day, sometimes falling and sometimes stopping. After nightfall, not even small puddles of water formed on the streets of Jingdo. It was just so wet that it made one feel a sliver of sticky annoyance. In the chaotic spring garden of New Scholar Tree Alley, plants grew like crazy, just like a person's ambition and lofty aspirations. A great deal of rainwater accumulated in the grass nests and in the eyes of the flowers. It was like a beautiful and alluring jar of honey. He Zongwei silently turned his back to the study and looked at the spring garden washed by the rain. The honey in his heart gradually melted. He knew that his thoughts were beautiful but also dangerous. The slightest carelessness would result in eternal damnation. Fan Xian was not so easy to kill. What shocked He Zongwei even more was that in his 6 years of contact with Fan Xian, he could always see a glimmer of murderous coldness in the young official's eyes. He was now the imperial censor of the left and a scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Without the emperor's personal command, the Overwatch Council could not touch him. Fighting against Fan Xian in court had, for a time, attracted countless officials to come to him. It looked like he was in limitless glory, but only he knew that he was actually walking down a path of death. His present situation was truly precarious. If the trend in court continued like this, He Zongwei's future focus would still be on the imperial censorate to keep the Overwatch Council in check. However, once the emperor passed, could this situation still be maintained? Regardless of whether the third prince sat on the throne or some other shocking change, it made no difference to He Zongwei. It only depended on when he stepped down and how much he was suppressed. However, He Zongwei had no solution to this trend. If he continued like this, step by step, even if he became the head scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, what power would he have when facing the person on the dragon chair in the future? He had once tried to find an opportunity to get close to the third prince deep in the palace and seek the greatest support for the rest of his life. All his attempts these 3 years had been forcefully cut off by an unknown power when he was about to approach the inner palace. It was because of these failures that he realized with horror just how powerful the power in Fan Xian's hands was. His influence in the royal palace was far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. Because of his fear and because he knew his future would not be pretty, He Zongwei wanted to stand against Fan Xian more and more, particularly after the emperor had personally appointed a marriage with the intention of easing the relationship between his two beloved generals. However, he had been forcefully refused by Fan Xian. Other than disappointment, He Zongwei knew that he had no other path to take. Perhaps the emperor was just a little angry, but He Zongwei was afraid from the bottom of his heart. Although the emperor was Fan Xian's father, his understanding of Fan Xian was not as profound as He Zongwei's. There was an old saying that the people who understood you the most were often not your family or friends, but your enemies. He Zongwei knew that Fan Xian would not let him go. He would not be like the emperor and truly think that Fan Xian was a pure and solitary official who put the interests of the Qin kingdom first in everything. In his eyes, Fan Xian was a strange being who always put his likes and dislikes first. It had to be said that He Zongwei's judgment of Fan Xian was correct. There was no hatred in He Zongwei's eyes. There was only a faint self-mockery and an icy coldness. He left the messy spring garden and returned to the study. The decorations in the study were relatively simple, but there were many books and account books piled on the bookshelves on either side. He walked to the side of the bookshelf and thought for a moment. From an unremarkable position, he pulled out a small booklet. Then, he sat beside the desk and began to examine it carefully. This small booklet was the list of names the Ministry of Rights and the Internal Court had worked together to compile after the Jingdo Rebellion. He Zongwei was in charge of the Imperial Censorate and had the Emperor's trust. A long time ago, he had gotten his hands on this list. Furthermore, he had read it countless times in this quiet study. The third page, page 42, was the most wrinkled. It looked like it was the place he had flipped through the most. Before and after these 2 pages were the birthplaces and names of the 100 Tiger Guards who had died for the country and the people of the Overwatch Council who had died in the line of duty on Dongshan Road. There were 2 names that stood out. One was Gao De, and the other was Wang Qinian. Regardless of whether it was this small booklet, the Ministry of Right's final seal, the Overwatch Council's request for credit, or the Internal Court's final approval, they all determined that these 2 people were dead. However, He Zongwei did not believe it. From a long time ago, he did not believe that these 2 people were dead. Even though he later confirmed that these 2 people were among the bodies collected on Dong Mountain, he still did not believe it. The Overwatch Council could easily do such a thing. It was still the same thing. He Zongwei understood Fan Xian better than the emperor. What made him suspect this was because of some small details these few years. First of all, Gao De and Wang Qinian were Fan Xian's most trusted aides. They should not have died so quietly in the emperor's eyes. In the emperor's eyes, they were both unremarkable people. In He Zongwei's eyes, these 2 people had their own importance. Secondly, he had been watching Fan Xian in secret these few years, watching his every move, including when Fan Xian had taken Fan Ruoruo and the Overwatch Council officials to the mausoleum a few days ago. Not long after the matter, he had heard the news and had personally gone to investigate. Just like in the past few years, Fan Xian's visit to the memorial garden was as quiet as ever. Most importantly, Fan Xian did not purposely stop in front of the 2 graves with Wang Qinian and Gao Da's names written on them and burn some paper money. Fan Xian was a very protective official who cared for his subordinates, particularly trusted aides who had died. Logically speaking, they should not have received such treatment. In the end, the reason He Zongwei made up his mind to determine that these 2 people were not dead was another small detail. After he became suspicious, he began to use the power of the Imperial Censorate to secretly watch from the side and let out a cry. Gouda had never married or had children in his life. After his death, his troubles ended. But Wang Qinian, the head of the Overwatch Council stationed in northern Qi, had a wife, a daughter, and a family. Although the Overwatch Council gave him a pension every year, no one knew who had taken it. Most importantly, after Wang Qinian died, it was said that his entire family had moved back home. In the Wang family's hometown, no one had discovered the whereabouts of this family. If Wang Qinian had truly died, Fan Xian would certainly be responsible for the Wang family's daily life. Given his personality, he would not allow Wang Qinian's widow and daughter to wander the world miserably. Wang Qinian did not die. Naturally, Gouda did not die either. Why were the bodies of the two people who did not die on Dong Mountain? Why did the Overwatch Council help them hide it? On Dong Mountain, 100 tiger guards shed hot blood to block the sword. Gouda was among them, so why did he not die? Had he escaped at the last moment? Wang Qinian had been by the emperor's side at the top of the mountain. If he had not died, why was there no sign of him afterward? Could it be that when the emperor was in danger, he had already escaped? He Zongwei slowly closed the scroll. A slight smile rose to the corners of his lips. He thought to himself, the powerful subordinate that Sir Fan Jr. had brought indeed had Fan Xian's style at a critical moment. He ran faster than anyone and saw himself as more important than anyone else. This was a great crime of deceiving the emperor. This crime was punishable by death by 1,000 cuts. He Zongwei understood the emperor's personality too well. As long as someone betrayed him, or rather, as long as an official placed their life before the emperor's safety, he would fly into a thunderous rage and be ruthless in his heart. Furthermore, there were many people who deceived the emperor. If Wang Qinian and Gouda were captured and brought back, it would be difficult for them to escape death. What about the Overwatch Council? What about Fan Xian? He Zongwei took a deep breath. His young and tired face immediately appeared a bit livelier and more austere. When it came to Fan Xian, he could not find any openings to attack. Thus, he could only wait for that wretched day. Unless, before the emperor died, he could incite the relationship between the emperor and Fan Xian. To incite the relationship between a father and son, one had to use such an illusory method as intentions. The crime of deceiving the emperor was something that destroyed one's heart. When all was said and done, this was probably Fan Xian's only lifeline in this life. He was too sentimental. If he had directly killed Gouda and Wang Qinian, none of this would have happened. Thinking of this, He Zongwei couldn't help but smile and shake his head. Immediately after, he lowered his head and gently tapped the teacup on the table, making a ding sound. Before long, two people walked in. One of them was about 30 years old with a respectful expression on his face. Looking at his facial features, he was rather similar to He Zongwei's. The other person was about 50 years old but still wore the attire of a Confucian scholar. Wang Qinian, Gouda, He Zongwei didn't hold back on his choice of words. Straightforwardly, he said, "We've been investigating these two people for over a year. Do you have any clues?" The person who looked like He Zongwei was actually a distant cousin. His voice was slightly raspy as he replied, "I vaguely caught some clues. However, when the Overwatch Council does things, even if you catch wind of it, you won't be able to catch up. Everything stopped 3 years ago. Even if these two people still have secret connections to the Overwatch Council, I'm afraid it's still a place we can't touch." He Zongwei furrowed his brows and nodded. He knew that given the power of the Overwatch Council, regardless of whether Director Chen personally acted or Fan Xian made the arrangements, the officials in court alone would not be able to move that metal plate. Unless he secretly ordered the Ministry of Justice and Supreme Court to go out and capture them, the problem was that this had to be done in secret. The Ministry of Justice and Supreme Court had Overwatch Council spies hidden within them. Once his actions alerted Fan Xian and caused the other party to block this opening, or even secretly do something vicious out of anger, it was not something He Zongwei wanted to see. "Sir, we won't be able to find anything in this matter by ourselves. The bodies on Dong Mountain have been counted. Although I don't know how the Overwatch Council did it, the number of people matched up with the name list. Furthermore, there was a fire on the mountain path at that time. The faces were burned like that, so it was impossible to say anything wrong." The slightly older scholar still didn't say anything. The person who spoke was He Zongwei's distant cousin. This person had only begun to work for He Zongwei in recent years. He handled matters cautiously and was already He Zongwei's trusted aide. Thus, he had been sent to investigate this major matter. His words were also relatively direct. During the Jingdo Rebellion, the North Expedition Army happened to surround the mountain. At least a few thousand people died in that battle. It would not be difficult for the Overwatch Council to secretly do something and move two bodies. He Zongwei lowered his head and furrowed his brows as he calculated. Even if there was a fire on the mountain path, what about on the summit? Although the battle between the Grandmasters was powerful, not many people died in front of the ancient temple. Back then, weren't Ren Zhengqing and the officials of the Ministry of Rites all alive and well? Why did Wang Qinian die? Did he die at the summit or on the path down the mountain? If his body was not burned, something strange could be found. But, 3 years have already passed. The body has long turned to ash. If they say the one buried in the grave is Wang Qinian, they can only accept it as Wang Qinian. The scholar finally opened his mouth. Once he spoke, he went straight to the point. Thus, to investigate what happened a few years ago again would be too difficult. Secondly, we would never be able to find any problems. If you truly want to open a path in this direction, I think it is more important to find Wang Qinian and Gao De alive. He Zongwei sank into silence. Of course, he knew his strategist's opinion was correct. The problem was, if Gao De and Wang Qinian were hiding in Dongyi or northern Qi and concealing their identities, who would be able to dig out these two living people? You can leave first. He Zongwei raised his head and said to his cousin in an even voice, "This matter involves the face of the court. Be careful." He had already established himself in the center of the court for 3 years and had gathered some power, particularly the emperor, who had secretly given him some help. However, compared to Fan Xian, he was still a long way off. This cousin was the most important person to help He Zongwei carry out the shameful things. It was true that the He household was incorruptible, but if He Zongwei wanted to gain a foothold in the court, he still needed money. He needed to support a large group of subordinates who were loyal to him. That cousin was the person who dealt with this matter. There was only He Zongwei and the elderly strategist left in the study. It appeared rather quiet. After a moment of silence, He Zongwei said, "If we can actually capture Wang Qinian and Gao De alive and bring them back to Jingdo, what do you think will happen?" "Sir Fan Jr. will certainly protect these two people." The strategist lowered his head slightly. The strategist lowered his head slightly and said, "Given the Emperor's personality, if this matter does not become too big, perhaps he will give Sir Fan Jr. face and cover it up." "You mean, even if these two people have committed the crime of deceiving the Emperor will let them go?" A cold light appeared in He Zongwei's eyes as he spoke in an icy voice. A complicated feeling rose in his heart. If the Emperor was truly benevolent enough to let those two people go, then what was the point of him working so hard? The key is to see what kind of price Sir Fan Jr. will pay for these two subordinates. The strategist smiled bitterly. Everyone under heaven knows that Sir Fan Jr. treats his subordinates very well. If he really shed all pretense of cordiality and insisted on protecting these two people, what would the Emperor do? Was he supposed to just kill him? "Sir, don't forget, Sir Fan Jr. is, in the end, the Emperor's own son." "Own son?" He Zongwei slowly closed his eyes. "The Crown Prince and Second Prince are also the Emperor's own sons. These words are not false. However, the crown prince and second prince did not help the emperor take down Dongyi without bloodshed. When the strategist said the words, "second prince," his voice trembled. Immediately after, he said in a quiet voice, "To use a piece of territory to exchange for the lives of two subordinates, the emperor still has this bit of benevolence." Of course. The strategist glanced at the disappointed He Zongwei and lightly said, "Even if we can't force the emperor and Sir Fan Jr. to turn against each other, we can at least plant a thorn in the emperor's heart." He Zongwei shook his head and opened his eyes to look calmly at the strategist in front of him. "Fan Wuxia, you were originally one of the second prince's 8 generals. Because of the second prince's death, your hair turned white overnight. You have come to join me. Our goals are the same, so you know that if Fan Xian doesn't die, then I will. If you want to avenge the second prince, you have to think clearly. One thorn is far from enough." This old strategist, who looked to be over 50 years old, was one of the most capable 8 generals under the second prince, Fan Wuxia. Back then, the second prince and Fan Xian had a chaotic battle in Jingdo. The 8 generals had all died or been injured. However, Fan Wuxia had long ago seen that Fan Xian's power could not be stopped. After trying to persuade the second prince was useless, he had quietly left. Unexpectedly, many years later, after the second prince had taken poison and committed suicide, Fan Wuxia had returned to Jingdo and thrown himself under He Zongwei's wing, wholeheartedly seeking revenge for the second prince. Fan Wuxia was silent for a long time. He then quietly said, "If you want to make a big deal out of this, then it cannot be done in secret. It must be made known to the entire court. The emperor is someone who values face the most. At that time, no matter how powerful Sir Fan Jr. is, he will probably not be able to stop the murderous knife in the emperor's hand. If the emperor really kills Wang Qinian and Gouda this time, I am very curious as to what Fan Xian will do." He Zongwei smiled slightly and said, "Other than the emperor and the internal court, I can't think of anyone else who would be able to find those 2 people under the cover of the Overwatch Council in this vast sea of people. There is one most important problem." Fan Wuxia calmly looked into He Zongwei's eyes. "If you want to secretly report to the emperor, you will probably have to take a great risk yourself." "Oh, what do you mean?" He Zongwei did not reveal a trace of panic. He only asked indifferently. "You do not have concrete evidence at hand, only some guesses and analysis." "Of course, just based on these guesses and analysis, it should be enough to make the emperor suspicious." Fan Wuxia glanced at him again and quietly said, "The emperor will probably be suspicious of Sir Fan Jr., but he will also be suspicious of you. I am wholeheartedly loyal to the court and the emperor. Why does the emperor suspect me?" He Zongwei pressed his lips tightly together and said quietly, "The emperor will suspect that you are purposely trying to drive a wedge between him and Sir Fan Jr." He Zongwei was silent for a long time. "If the emperor truly becomes suspicious and no longer protects me, what do you think will happen to me? If the emperor doesn't like a person, there are many ways to deal with them. I think that in 3 years, the emperor will find an excuse to leave the Jingdo court and take up a post in a distant place. Then, you will certainly be mediocre for the rest of your life," Fan Wuxia calmly said. He Zongwei smiled bitterly and sighed. His eyes were filled with calmness and determination. "If I make a move, I may be swept into the dust in the future. But if I don't make a move, I will be crushed into pieces. Which one will you choose?" He gazed at Fan Wuxia and smiled slightly. "I choose the former because, at least, I can continue to live. If Fan Xian truly becomes hostile with the emperor, it will be difficult for him to continue living." Fan Wuxia blinked his eyes. His grizzled hair was particularly eye-catching in the dark study. Faintly, he said, "You seem to have some resentment toward the emperor." He Zongwei's expression did not change, but the emotions in his heart churned endlessly. He had endless gratitude toward the emperor, but he also had endless resentment. If the emperor had not brought him up to fight Fan Xian, how could he be constantly trapped in a precarious predicament? How could he be so afraid of dying without a burial ground? Back then, the second prince was actually in a similar situation as you are now. Fan Wujiu smiled slightly darkly and quietly advised, so, you must learn from the second prince's lesson and maintain a loyal heart toward the emperor. If you truly pull out Wang Qinian and Gouda, perhaps the emperor will not suspect you. The one who will be out of luck will be Fan Xian. I have always been loyal to the emperor. He Zhongwei calmly replied and lightly swept his gaze over Fan Wujiu. He knew what this person was trying to test. To avenge the death of the second prince, Fan Xian was naturally one of Fan Wujiu's targets. That heartless and cold-blooded emperor could not escape Fan Wujiu's eyes. He Zhongwei mockingly said, a person needs to know where his own abilities lie. Dealing with Fan Xian is almost beyond our abilities. As for those people who are above the clouds, it is best not to even think about them. They will kill you. This is a corrected version. It should have been Fan Wujiu, but I wrote it as Fan Bian. I confused it with Xia Bian. Apologies. Chapter 663. After Fan Wujiu heard He Zhongwei's cold words, he slowly lowered his head and did not have any obvious reaction. After a moment of silence, he said in a low voice, before reporting to the emperor, you should think of a way to investigate more clearly. Of course. All right, it's late. You should go rest, He Zhongwei said casually. He waved his hand and picked up the files on the table again. Fan Wujiu glanced at He Zhongwei. A glimmer of darkness flashed through his eyes. He bowed, and took his leave. When he walked out of the study, He Zhongwei immediately put down the files in his hands. He looked silently in the direction of the door and sank into deep thought. He Zhongwei was initially fearful of the second prince's 8 trusted generals joining him. After all, there were many people in Jingdou who knew of Fan Wujiu's identity. If people discovered this in the future and it got into the palace, who knew what the emperor would think? Back then, the second prince had been one of the conspirators in the rebellion. It was indeed risky for He Zhongwei to take in his old subordinates. However, he had quickly made a decision. After all, Fan Wujiu had his own abilities. Although the 8 generals whose names had spread through the Jianghu in Jingdou seemed unable to withstand a single blow in front of the Overwatch Council, in reality, they were all very powerful figures. The second prince had operated in court for a long time. The trusted aides he kept at his side were, of course, the most outstanding. Other than Fan Wujiu's ability, He Zhongwei had taken him in for 2 other important reasons. First, this person's goal was the same as his. They both wanted to defeat Fan Xian. Second, this person also controlled some of the resources the second prince had left behind. The second prince had already lost and died 3 years ago. His power in court had long been swept clean by the emperor and Fan Xian. In the end, there were still some officials hidden in the lower levels of the court who were waiting for an opportunity in the dark. Regardless of whether it was to avenge their master or find a new master, they would see the light of day again. He Zhongwei needed these people. These people also needed Scholar He in court. However, He Zhongwei could not personally gather these powers. He had to go through Fan Wujiu. Only then could he appear more innocent in front of the emperor. When all was said and done, He Zhongwei was walking on a lonely steel rope with endless abysses on both sides. It was very dangerous. Not long after Fan Wujiu left the study, the cousin of the He clan who had left earlier quietly returned. The 2 of them met each other's eyes and saw the glimmer of emotion in each other's eyes. He Zhongwei smiled warmly and said, "Go investigate the whereabouts of Wang Qinian and Gouda. Don't use the people the second prince left behind." The person bowed respectfully and replied, "I understand." After you and Fan talked earlier, sir, Fan, and Fan. He Zhongwei nodded approvingly. There are some things that are inconvenient for Mr. Fan to know. There were many things that were inconvenient for Fan Wujiu to know. Earlier, Fan Wujiu and He Zongwei had discussed that if they wanted to bring down Fan Xian, they had to start with Wang Qinian and Gouda, who might still be alive. However, given the power left behind by He Zongwei and the second prince, it was impossible to pierce through the layers of black fog of the Overwatch Council and find true clues. Thus, Fan Wujiu suggested that He Zongwei directly meet the emperor and use the emperor's suspicions to have the internal court act. The problem was that He Zongwei had a power in his hands. It was a power the emperor had given him, a power that no one knew about. The emperor trusted Chen Pingping incomparably and doted on Fan Xian. However, the Overwatch Council's power was truly too great. If it was only checked and balanced from the outside, an emperor would not be at ease. That was why there was the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Furthermore, the palace must have planted many trusted aides in the Overwatch Council. Concerning this matter, Chen Pingping and Fan Xian were both aware of it. However, there was no need to make things clear to the emperor. They were only guarding against it in secret. Since the Imperial Censorate wanted to challenge the Overwatch Council, the spies the Internal Court, or perhaps the Ministry of Internal Affairs, had planted in the Overwatch Council had slowly moved from Eunuch Yao's side to He Zongwei's hands 3 years later. This power, darker than the night, was currently controlled by He Zongwei's cousin. He Zongwei was silent for a moment and then said, "Investigate from the outside. If the Overwatch Council still has connections to Wang Qinian, then there will certainly be traces. However, don't let these people know exactly what you are investigating. If the emperor knows you are investigating and asks, 'What will we do?' the emperor will not care about such small matters." He Zongwei lowered his head slightly. "After the investigation is complete, report to the emperor and ask him to make a decision." Of course, if He Zongwei grasped this important matter that could incite the relationship between the emperor and Fan Xian, he would not quietly and secretly report it to the emperor and give the emperor and Fan Xian a chance to privately negotiate. Instead, he would do everything in his power to blow this matter up. The person understood the hidden meaning in Fan Xian's words and didn't say anything more. Straightforwardly, he said, "I will not disappoint you." The study once again returned to silence. He Zongwei sat behind the desk and couldn't resist shaking his head. He didn't have a servant, but he had a few advisors. However, those advisors were all forbidden from entering the back garden. Other than his trusted aides, no one dared to go near this study. He knew that if he could truly trust Fan Wujiu, then this matter would certainly proceed more easily. However, he could not completely trust Fan Wujiu, particularly when he appeared in front of him as a strategist. For people like strategists, He Zongwei always had the greatest suspicions in his heart. Many years ago, he had successfully made a name for himself by bringing down Lin Ruofu. In reality, he knew that the fall of the previous prime minister had little to do with him. This was the emperor's intention. The person who truly carried out the order and gave the prime minister the heaviest blow was the seemingly handsome and carefree strategist in the prime minister's manor, Yuan Hongdao. Back then, He Zongwei had brought Wu Bo and's wife to live in this old royal manor. Under the eldest princess's orders, he was in contact with the prime minister's manor and had dealings with Yuan Hongdao. He knew what kind of dangerous knife Yuan Hongdao had stabbed in this matter. The truth that had been slowly revealed a few years ago shocked him even more. Yuan Hongdao was actually a member of the Overwatch Council. The Overwatch Council. He Zongwei's heart felt a glimmer of coldness. He was very afraid of the Overwatch Council's power. Although he now held some internal members of the Overwatch Council in his hands, the more he understood about the Overwatch Council, the more afraid he was. He was afraid that the gardener in his manor was a spy from the first bureau of the Overwatch Council. He was afraid that the chubby female servant was an assassin from the 6th bureau. He was afraid that the food he ate every day was laced with slow-acting poison from the 3rd bureau. He was afraid that even Fan Wujiu, the strategist the second prince had left behind, might also be a member of the Overwatch Council. Would he, in the future, stab his body with the most ruthless knife? He wanted to deal with Fan Xian, so he was even more afraid that Fan Xian would deal with him. It had already been a number of years. He had received everyone's respect in court. When he returned to the manor, he was immersed in an unhealthy feeling of fear and unease. He always felt that everyone he saw in the manor could have been sent by the Overwatch Council. Thus, the He Manor did not have many servants and girls. He used very few people. Even if he had no choice but to use people, he would rather go through great hardship to find his brothers from his hometown. Unexpectedly, this had earned him a reputation for being honest and modest. Sometimes, He Zongwei even felt that he was about to be driven crazy by this nervous feeling. Crazy. But, he could not go crazy. He had to obtain the final victory. He had already found a glimmer of an obscure yet blinding white light at the edge of the dark sky. He pushed open the door and stood alone in the corridor. His face was slightly pale, and his mood was unusually heavy. Occasionally, he would think of that woman, and a trace of pain would appear in his eyes. No one knew what kind of torment scholar he was suffering in his heart. No one thought he was a person who was about to go crazy. A few days after the birthday banquet in the Sun Manor, the civil and martial officials in court, and even the scholars and common people who had heard some rumors, all knew that Scholar He had lost this battle. He had lost completely. The emperor did not issue an edict. Instead, he had He Zongwei handle the matter of the Jingdo magistrate himself. It was clear he wanted to use this matter to establish Scholar He's authority in court. Unexpectedly, after Fan Xian returned from Dongyi, drank some wine, went to the palace to argue, and took a trip to the Imperial College, he had beaten back Scholar He's extended hand. As for Scholar He's loss of face and failure, no one found it strange. After all, the opponent he faced this time was not an official of the 6 ministries in court or a disciple of the nobility. It was Fan Xian. It was fine if Fan Xian did not take action. As long as he set his mind to do something, he would always be able to do it. This had already become the common understanding of the entire world. It was clear that the emperor did not have any good ideas for this illegitimate child. After all, he was just a mere Jingdo magistrate. The emperor could not truly fall out with his most favored illegitimate child. The old accountant sent by the Ministry of Revenue to check accounts left the Jingdo government wretchedly. The secret investigation by the Ministry of Appointments and the Ministry of Justice was also fortunately brought to a halt under the powerful pressure from the mountain. Although Hu the scholar did not say anything in the Hall of Governmental Affairs, he quietly reminded the officials in front of He Zongwei. Although this sentence was light, it was also very heavy. Jingdo was clear and bright. It had long passed the April Qingming festival. The spring scenery was bright and beautiful. Dressed in casual clothes, Fan Xian sat on a horse. Holding a willow branch, he pointed toward the east and smiled and chatted about something with the officials seeing him off. He had beaten He Zongwei again and gained the upper hand in his argument with the emperor. At least, he ensured that the power on his side would not be weakened too much in a short period of time. Fan Xian was in a good mood. Even though he was about to embark on another journey and go to the medicinal sword hut in Dongyi to suffer, he was still in a good mood. After exchanging pleasantries with the officials seeing him off and accepting a large basket of flattery, as well as the cold and sour words secretly directed at He Zongwei, Fan Xian's expression did not change. He left the pavilion, dismounted from his horse, and continued to hide in his family's black carriage. The surroundings were quiet, but there was another person in the carriage. Yan Bingyun looked at him and suddenly said, "There are already signs of unrest in Dongyi. Do you really not want me to go suppress it? This time, I will bring the Black Knights into the city." A faint worry rose between Fan Xian's brows. The old director will be returning home in a few days. Stay here and watch for me. If you also leave with me, who in Jingdo will make decisions for the council? Yan Bingyun acutely saw the worry in his heart. He did not understand but did not ask directly. Instead, he said, He Zongwei has lost a great deal of face this time. Presumably, the Imperial Censorate will be quiet for a long time. Don't underestimate him, Fan Xian said. Although these officials said bad things about him in front of me today, if this was a different occasion and in front of He Zongwei, who would dare to say anything loudly? The position of an official is still in the Emperor's word. As long as the Emperor's favor remains, he will not fall. Furthermore, he is a powerful character. Fan Xian suddenly smiled slightly. Fan Xian suddenly smiled slightly and said, In the past, I always felt that He Zongwei's scale was too small. Unexpectedly, he did something unexpected. Yan Bingyun did not smile. Calmly, he said, I found out that Fan Wujiu is in the He Manor. If you really want to deal with He Zongwei, just let the Emperor know. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then shook his head and said, Fan Wujiu's choice surprised me. Back then, when he fled Jingdo, it was clear that he was a cowardly person afraid of death. Unexpectedly, after the second prince died, he had the courage to return to Jingdo and carry out his so-called plan of revenge. He raised his hand to rub between his brows. Raising his face, he sighed in admiration. Fan Wujiu's action is very old-fashioned. I admire it very much. Yan Bingyun furrowed his brows and said, I don't believe that you admire He Zongwei very much. I also don't believe that you would let He Zongwei go because of something like old-fashioned. Right now, I have to take care of a major matter. Before the director returns home, you and I shouldn't do anything to prevent variables from happening, Fan Xian said seriously. The tip of Yan Bingyun's heart trembled slightly. There were not many things that could shock him, but from Fan Xian's words, he smelled a very dangerous scent. There shouldn't be any problems, Fan Xian said quietly. But, there can't be any more incidents in the near future. There can't be any big movements in court. Let's not rush to do anything. What is He Zongwei rushing to do? Yan Bingyun handed a piece of paper to his hand and calmly said, Although I haven't found out, there have been some undercurrents in the council recently. I don't know the reason. Fan Xian sank into deep thought. He was not an immortal, and the Overwatch Council was not omnipotent. Furthermore, it was probably because of some emotional reasons that he did not want to think about whether or not old Wang, who had been closest to him, was doing well in the distance. For a moment, he had not thought about this. As for Gouda, Fan Xian had long thought he was dead. Fan Wujiu alone is enough to force He Zongwei off the stage. It is as if we have a sharp weapon in our hands, Fan Xian said. If He Zongwei does make any big movements, throw Fan Wujiu out. There is no need for an official who takes in the old subordinates of a rebellious prince to continue staying in court. Yan Bingyun was silent for a moment. He then said, Sir, he has made a fatal mistake. Fan Xian said, That is because he thinks he understands the Emperor and the abilities of the Overwatch Council. In reality, he doesn't know anything. I made a mistake yesterday. It was a terrible mistake. It had nothing to do with mistakes in writing or words. It was purely a matter of not being serious enough. I apologize again to everyone. Chapter 664. 10 li out of the capital, the group of carriages stopped for a moment. Yan Bingyun disembarked from the carriage and did not send them off. Watching Sir Yan Jr.'s disappearing figure, Fan Xian smiled warmly. He thought that since the council already had a handle on He Zongwei, Jingdo should be fine. Fan Xian would not look down on He Zongwei. He trusted the Emperor's eyesight very much. He knew that He Zongwei certainly had his abilities. However, in front of the Overwatch Council, the scholar's abilities often appeared to be insufficient. Thus, his attitude in dealing with this problem appeared to be relatively relaxed. As for whether or not this relaxation was a sufficiently correct attitude, that would depend on how things developed in the future. Mu Feng rode to the side of the carriage window and thought of the intelligence report he had just received. He felt surprised in his heart. As the temporary leader of the Qinian unit, he knew all of Sir Fan Jr.'s shady and private matters. However, the matter mentioned in this intelligence report was something that even he had never come into contact with. What exactly was it that made Sir Fan Jr. so cautious? Mu Feng swallowed and moistened his dry throat. Lowering his voice, he said, "A reply from Yu Chang." Mu Feng had no idea what Yu Chang referred to. During these 2 years, Sir Fan Jr. and Yu Chang had exchanged 3 letters. Not only did these 3 letters go through the council's highest-level mail route, but the people who delivered the letters along the way were all core members of the Qinian unit. However, even these core members did not know who the letter had ended up in. Where was Yu Chang? What did Yu Chang refer to? Mu Feng had endless questions in his heart. Since the commissioner did not say, he could not guess. He did not dare to guess. Fan Xian was just about to put down the curtain on the carriage window. After hearing this news, he smiled and quietly said, "Where's the letter?" Mu Feng made a whistle. All of the Overwatch Council's secret agents and swordsmen beside the carriage spread out. They each controlled the surroundings of the road and the direction of the woodlands. They surrounded the black carriage in which Fan Xian was in. Fan Xian took the letter and glanced at it. He remembered the words clearly. The words on the letter were all very common, and the meaning put together was also very common. But only the writer and the receiver knew the true meaning. He suddenly felt an itch at the top of his ear. He couldn't help but scratch it. Closing his palm, he crushed the entire letter into a snowflake. This was a method he had long gotten used to. He had once seen it. The emperor seemed to have this habit as well. Perhaps those who had learned the tyrannical true qi all had too much true qi and used it as a human shredder. These rather absurd and cute thoughts suddenly appeared in Fan Xian's mind. A faint and quiet smile rose to his face. It was clear that he was in a good mood. Mu Feng didn't know why he was in a good mood and asked hesitantly, "Sir, should we continue along the same path?" "No." Fan Xian restrained his expression and said seriously, "Go to Dongyi on your own. I will meet you outside the city." Mu Feng was slightly startled and didn't dare to accept the order. The director had strict orders to not allow you to move alone again. "I am now the director." Fan Xian looked at him with a smile. Mu Feng was slightly embarrassed. Only now did he remember that before they left the capital, the emperor had already issued a decree to the world. Sir Fan Jr. had officially taken over Director Chen's position and became the second director of the Overwatch Council of the Qin Kingdom. He was no longer the commissioner of the past. The black carriages gradually left. Fan Xian stood in the woods and looked at his loyal subordinates. He thought to himself that he was responsible for too many people's lives. Perhaps this was a very headache-inducing matter. South of Jingdo was Weizhou. The city by the Wei River was radiated by the splendor of Jingdo. It was also a place that high officials, nobles, and wealthy merchants had to pass through on their way to Jiangnan. Although the city was not large, it still appeared particularly prosperous. Wherever it was prosperous, there were bound to be brothels and gambling dens. Thus, Weizhou, without exception, had opened a Baoyue brothel. Far away from Baoyue brothel was Weizhou's largest and most extravagant gambling den, the 1,000 Gold Pavilion. Speaking of the 1,000 Gold Pavilion, it was easy for people to think of it as a brothel. Fan Xian, who was disguised as a merchant, raised his head and looked at the 3 large words on the 1,000 Gold Pavilion signboard. He couldn't help but laugh. The gambling den had long since become a boiling cauldron of voices. Even though there was a large ventilation fan produced by the palace treasury that was constantly being used by the coolies, the smell of people mingled with the smell of perfume and alcohol. It was still a little unpleasant, and Fan Xian couldn't help but cover his nose. Looking around, he confirmed that the person he was looking for was definitely not waiting for him on the first floor, so he walked up to the second floor. Unexpectedly, at the entrance of the second floor, he was stopped by two people who seemed to be in charge of the building. Fan Xian was slightly surprised, but he immediately understood what had happened. He couldn't help but laugh at himself. With Fan Xian's status, of course, no one in this world would dare to stop him. He was used to this, so he walked directly up the stairs without any disguise. He didn't expect that today, he was just an ordinary merchant. The second floor of the 1,000 Gold Pavilion was the place where one could truly spend a lot of money. The people who came here to play were all wealthy and respectable. Even if there were occasional disputes, they all had a sense of propriety, so they had a good reputation. However, such a place always required a threshold, and Fan Xian's current appearance clearly did not allow him to cross that threshold. "Sir, if you are in the mood, why don't you stay downstairs and have some fun?" Although the steward did not give Fan Xian any face by stopping him at the entrance, his tone was still rather gentle. It could be seen that the management of the 1,000 Gold Pavilion was good. Fan Xian smiled and said, "I'm here to look for a friend." The steward was slightly surprised. After a moment's deliberation, he softly asked, "May I know the surname of the friend you are looking for? If there is an urgent matter, we can report it on your behalf." "My friend's surname is Guan." Hearing the word Guan, the steward's expression immediately changed. He immediately bowed slightly, but was extremely careful not to attract the attention of the gamblers on the first floor. He extended a hand and very respectfully led Fan Xian to the second floor, placing him in a very unique room. He then lowered his voice and said, "Sir, please wait a moment." Fan Xian sat in the room. It didn't take long before he heard the sound of hurried footsteps coming from outside. A charming young woman walked in with a slightly nervous expression. The steward also walked in with the young woman. He reported, "It is this sir who is looking for a friend with the surname Guan. Go out. You know what to do." The young woman bowed slightly to Fan Xian with extreme respect, then spoke to the steward. The steward made a sound of acknowledgement and pushed open the door. However, he still could not suppress the shock in his heart. There was actually someone in this world who could make Big Sister Guan so afraid. He wondered who this merchant-looking person was. There was only Fan Xian and the young woman left in the room. The young woman immediately began to bow again and knelt in front of Fan Xian. Very respectfully, she said, "Subordinate Guan Wumei greets the commissioner." Because she was missing an arm, Guan Wumei's kneeling was not steady. Because of the fear that had never faded in her heart, her voice trembled slightly. Fan Xian looked at her and sighed in his heart. One of this woman's arms had been cut off by his hand. No wonder she was so afraid of him. Nearly 5 years had passed since Fan Xian's first trip to Jiangnan. Xia Qifei had once again taken back the Ming family, and this cousin of Xia Qifei, a famous female bandit in Jiangnan, had successfully inherited the Jiangnan water bandits. With the powerful support of the new Ming family, in addition to the secret assistance of the Overwatch Council, Guan Wumei had established a high position on the Jianghu without much effort. It was still the same old saying. The Jianghu was only a part of the country. With Fan Xian behind Guan Wumei, even if he wanted her to be a gangster, what was so difficult about it? Stand up and talk. Fan Xian looked at her and did his best to say as gently as possible. "Right, there is one more thing. I have officially taken over the Overwatch Council. In the future, don't call me Commissioner." Guan Wumei was a peripheral member of the Overwatch Council. The edict in Jingdo had not yet been announced, so when she suddenly heard this news, she couldn't help but be shocked. In an instant, the shock in her eyes turned to joy. She had never held a grudge against Sir Fan Jr. in her heart, even if he had chopped off one of her arms. Sir Fan Jr. had avenged her cousin and taken back the Ming family. More importantly, she knew what kind of person she was. Holding a grudge against Sir Fan Jr.? She had never even thought about it, so this joy came from the bottom of her heart. After all, to survive in Jiangnan, she had to rely on Fan Xian's position in court. In the past 2 years, she had heard that the Overwatch Council had been suppressed in Jingdo. The people of Jiangnan were also restless. Learning that Fan Xian had become the director of the Overwatch Council, Guan Wumei let out a big sigh of relief. Have the Lingnan Xiong family and Chuanzhou Sun family finally relented? Fan Xian straightforwardly asked about the purpose of his trip. During these 3 years, he had been secretly working on a secret project, hidden from everyone under heaven. However, this project wasted too much money. Although he controlled the palace treasury in his hands, it was, after all, the palace treasury belonged to the court. Most of the money from smuggling had been used to fund the disaster relief for the embankments that the court urgently needed. For a time, it was not convenient. Even Xia Qifei's Xia Mingji, which was now the new Ming family, secretly gave Fan Xian the greatest amount of support. Even his brother Fan Xizha, who was in the north, had sent large amounts of banknotes to the south under the northern Qi royal family's close surveillance. However, Fan Xian still felt that he lacked money. Would Sir Fan Jr. lack money to spend? If this got out, it would probably become a big joke. But, this was true. It also meant that the project Fan Xian had been working on in secret these 3 years was a black hole that wasted countless amounts of silver. Guan Wumei had already stood and carefully glanced at Fan Xian. She and Xia Qifei both knew that Sir Fan Jr. had spent a lot of money these few years, but they still didn't know where all this money had been spent. Furthermore, it had been fine the first 2 years. Relying on Fan Xian's subordinates, they had barely been able to support it. However, a few days ago, they had suddenly received news that a large sum of silver was needed this year. It made it difficult for them to raise it. This sum of silver was too large. Even if Xia Qifei and Fan Xizha were given enough time, they probably wouldn't be able to raise it. The news came too late. We only had time to notify the Sun and Xiong families. Since we couldn't explain to them what exactly this sum of silver was used for, their masters were unwilling to relent, Guan Wumei replied slightly nervously. The 2 leaders are currently in the Shazhou, not far from the Weizhou. Does Milord want to see them? There's no need. Fan Xian shook his head. This matter has to be done in secret. However, I'm afraid we won't be able to hide it for long if we have to ask the Sun and Xiong families to transfer silver. It's my fault for being too hasty. I still have to think about it. Guan Wumei let out a large breath. Truthfully speaking, even with Sir Fan Jr.'s help, it was still a difficult matter to secretly transfer so much silver away from the court's supervision. What scared Guan Wumei the most was that Sir Fan Jr. was spending so much silver and still hiding it from the court. Was he secretly organizing a private army in preparation for a rebellion? Otherwise, given Sir Fan Jr.'s present status, he would not do such a thing. Have Xia Qifei and the Sun and Xiong families tell them not to bring me out, Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly and said. Just say that there's a problem with the smuggling route to the north. The northern Qi court suddenly acted and seized all of the goods. The Ming family needs to return silver to the palace treasury and also needs to have a flow of money out of their accounts. They don't have enough time, so they need a large sum of silver from these 2 families to support them. This was a good excuse. The only powers that could suddenly make the Jiangnan Ming family lose a large sum of silver were the courts in the north and south. Guan Wumei furrowed her brows and asked, however, the court has a lot of spies in the north. Even if the Overwatch Council's route can be hidden, there will always be other intelligence channels that will come back. There is no movement in northern Qi at all. She sighed with some distress. Unless we have the northern Qi court cooperate with us in putting on a show. After saying this, she couldn't help but laugh self-mockingly. The Qing kingdom and northern Qi had been enemies for a long time. Sir Fan Jr.'s close relationship with the north had been completely shattered because of the Battle of Shiliang last year. Additionally, everyone knew about the ownership of Dongyi. The northern Qi people hated Fan Xian to the bone. How could they cooperate with him in putting on a show? Good acting, Fan Xian said with a slight smile. I'll have the northern Qi emperor cooperate with me in putting on a good show. We'll hide it from the court and then give the Sun and Xiong families a convincing reason. What do you think? Guan Wumei was shocked. She felt that she could not see through Sir Fan Jr.'s depths. It was as if he was teasing her and said he wanted the northern Qi emperor to cooperate with him in putting on a show. I'm going to stay a night in Weizhou. The Sun and Xiong families came first. Entertain them. Fan Xian raised his teacup. Guan Wumei took her leave. However, the room did not remain quiet for long. A man dressed in black appeared in the corner of the room like a ghost. He carried an extremely long saber on his back. The saber was sheathed, and its murderous aura was restrained. However, the feeling it gave people was that it was abnormally dangerous. Fan Xian gently put down his teacup and raised his head to look at him. Why do you suddenly need so much silver? The black-clothed knife-wielding man was still standing in the shadows in the corner. In a slightly raspy voice, he smiled and said, when construction reaches the later stages, money is always spent very quickly. These are the original words of the minister. Chapter 665. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He looked at the person in the shadows and hesitated for a moment before opening his mouth to ask, "Why are you so happy?" "Although we don't see each other often, I'm still not used to it." The knife man in the black shadow bowed slightly and said with a smile, "I have always been such a frivolous person. Please forgive me, Sir Fan Jr." "Frivolous?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, "No wonder you caused such a big mess back then because of your playfulness. The palace named you to be eliminated." The bladesman's expression turned grave, and he said seriously, "It is all thanks to Lord Minister that I am still alive today." Fan Xian didn't say anything more. Instead, he thought of other things, other people. In the Battle of Dong Mountain, over 100 tiger guards had all died. The emperor had used the sword in Siga Jian's hand to cold-bloodedly and mercilessly purge the tiger guards. He had also swept away the greatest support Fan Jian had hidden within the royal family. It was precisely because of this attitude and resolve that Fan Jian had no choice but to retreat from the dangerous Jingdou early. Minister Fan had grown up with the emperor and had operated in court for many years. He had even secretly helped the Li royal family train the tiger guards for a long time. Naturally, he had some hidden cards. The black-clad bladesman before Fan Xian was one of them. This black-clothed knife man had once been a subordinate of the tiger guards. However, he later faked his death and became Fan Jian's direct subordinate in the darkness. He secretly did things for the Fan Manor that could not see the light of day, including monitoring the tentacles that extended out of the palace. During the Jingdou rebellion, Fan Xian had taken a great risk to attack Qingyu Hall. Fan Jian had watched from behind with cold eyes and helped him clean up the mess. At that time, the ones who had acted were the secret forces of the Fan Manor, led by the black-clothed knife man. It was not until that day that Fan Xian truly came into contact with his father's last batch of power. "You also know about what happened on Dong Mountain." Fan Xian looked at the bladesman and asked, "How many tiger guards are still alive in this world?" "There are still 21 subordinates under the minister." The black-clothed bladesman said with a smile, "If all the great grandmasters are dead, we will still be of some use." In the past, Fan Xian had only interacted with Gao and the 7 wooden-faced tiger guards. For a moment, he was not used to the black-clothed knife-wielding man's tone of speech. He smiled bitterly and said, "Let's not talk about this for now. Back to what happened earlier. Suddenly bringing up so much silver, father, are you not worried that someone in court will guess something?" The black-clothed swordsman didn't answer this question. Instead, he chuckled and asked, "Young master, you seem to have grown a lot bolder recently. When the minister sent the news, you really began to prepare to transfer money. You even didn't hesitate to reach out to the Sun family and the Xiong family. Aren't you afraid that the imperial court will notice something? The moment this was said, Fan Xian sank into silence. The black-clad bladesman did not continue asking. In the 3 years after the Jingdo rebellion, the business Fan Xian secretly carried out in Yuchang had been done very carefully. He did not seek to be meritorious. Instead, he sought to be seamless. The progress was truly too slow. However, Fan Xian had no choice but to do this. Furthermore, his father, who was far away in Danzhou, seemed to agree with his caution. After all, with the emperor on the throne, no one dared to take the risk of stirring up trouble. If things got out, it would only be a scene of blood and fire. However, it seemed that Fan Xian and Fan Jian, father and son, had both begun to increase their pace. Fan Xian knew that his father had increased his pace because he knew that his heart was beginning to gradually drift in that direction. The black-clothed swordsman's next words confirmed Fan Xian's guess. If young master wants to do something in the future, don't forget about me, the black-clothed swordsman said with a smile. I am also very interested in killing my way into the royal palace. The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. What I am interested in is, are you planning to avenge your family or those colleagues who died on Dong Mountain? Is there a difference? There is indeed no difference. For you and those tiger guards hiding in the dark, the emperor has never seen you as people. It is normal for you not to see him as a ruler. Fan Xian lowered his eyelids slightly and quietly said, but, if you say this in front of me, are you not afraid that I will actually kill you? You should know the relationship between the emperor and me. The black-clothed swordsman calmly said, I know the relationship between you and the minister even better. Very contradictory. Fan Xian smiled and sighed. You are a group of powerful swordsmen, but you are also a group of dangerous people. Even I don't know if I can control you. Thus, I think it would be best for you to stay by father's side, including the dark tiger guards at your side. Don't try to get involved in my matters. A faint disappointment flashed through the black-clothed swordsman's eyes. Only father can control you, and I want to control everything in my own hands, so I can't use you. Fan Xian gradually withdrew his smile and calmly said, I have my own power. You only have one thing. You must ensure father's safety. As long as you can do this and let me have no worries, perhaps I can achieve your and your brother's goal. The black-clothed swordsman fell silent. The silence lasted for a long time. Fan Xian took a sip of the cold tea at his side and unconsciously drew up his legs. Hugging his knees, he sat on the chair. This posture was not very beautiful, but it gave him a sense of security. It was in this instant that he thought of the second prince. Looking at the black-clothed swordsman in front of him, he also thought of Gao and the innocent people who had bled and died because of the emperor's schemes. He even thought of Chen Pingping and Jing Gu, who had slit Qin Heng's throat in front of the royal palace in Jingdo. It had been a while since he had seen Jing Gu. A glimmer of light flashed through Fan Xian's eyes. He thought of how Chen Pingping had done so many things in secret and pulled back many people from the brink of death. His father had actually done similar things in secret these years. These two old comrades in arms had not communicated much, but they both chose the same method. They probably both knew that only people who had truly experienced life and death would have the courage to stand in this world and resist all the pressure placed on them. Only people who had survived life and death could stand bravely, even proudly, and ruthlessly under the light of imperial power. This was probably the problem of will that Sigu Jian spoke of. It had nothing to do with the level of one's cultivation. Only such people could truly do great things, such as the black-clothed swordsman in front of him and the silver-masked Jing Gu. Go back and talk. I will resolve the problem of silver as soon as possible. However, to turn the paper in the money house into the nutrients that fish intestines needs is a very difficult matter. Fan Xian looked at the black-clothed swordsman and said cautiously, I am worried that there are spies from the palace at my side. That is why I sought out Guan Wumei to be my shadow on this trip to Weizhou. If the internal court, the Ministry of Justice, or the Imperial Censorate find something, they will only suspect this much. You have to be careful and not be targeted. The problem is, young master, you came to see Guan Wumei to raise money for fish intestines. The black-clothed swordsman furrowed his brows. What if the other party investigates from this side? You and I are like the other side of a cliff, forever a one-way connection. Even if someone wants to investigate, at most, they will find me and not be able to investigate further. As for the direction of the flow of silver, the first part of the process in the accounts will be handled by the old officials of the Ministry of Revenue my father left in Jiangnan. As for the latter part of the conversion, Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. It seemed that he also felt this matter was difficult. Slowly, he said, I can handle a portion. Then, it will depend on how things are in Dongyi. If there are goods coming in from overseas, it should be able to speed things up. Then, I will leave. Although the black-clothed swordsman felt that Fan Xian had not finished what he should have said, he knew he had to leave. Raising his hands in greeting, he said, however, during these 3 years, I have always been curious about something. Fan Xian raised his eyes to look at him and smiled. What is it? Why is it called fish intestines? After a long silence, Fan Xian said, fish intestines is a sword used by a person called Zhuanzhu. It is a sword hidden in the belly of a fish. This sword may forever be hidden in the belly of the fish and never see the light of day. Once it breaks out of the belly, it will certainly pierce into someone's chest. You are a handful of fish intestines. Jinggu was once a handful of fish intestines. The shadow beside me is also a handful of fish intestines, Fan Xian said with a slight smile. However, you are all beginning to see the light of day. Only my fish intestines are still hidden. Fan Xian stayed in Weizhou for a night and discussed the matter of gathering silver with Guan Wumei. Xia Qifei was in Suzhou and would not be able to rush over no matter what. He could only use Guan Wumei's mouth to remind the master of the new Ming family of the importance of this matter. The next day, the representatives sent out by the Lingnan Xiong family and Xuanzhou Sun family arrived in Weizhou. Fan Xian only watched from the shadows. After confirming the possible attitudes of these two giants, he relaxed. The new Ming family's excuse was indeed very practical. Although there was still no news from the north, the Sun and Xiong families would not believe that Xia Qifei would lie to them on this matter because there was no benefit to such a lie. When merchants lent money to each other, the key was still to consider the other party's ability to repay. In the eyes of the Sun and Xiong families, even if the northern Qi court began to vigorously attack the Ming family's smuggling to the north because of the Dongyi matter, Sir Fan Jr. was still behind the Ming family. With the endless supply of goods from the palace treasury as a guarantee, it would always be a golden nest. No matter what, it was impossible for them to not be able to repay the money. After confirming that this sum of silver would arrive, Fan Xian secretly had Guan Wumei notify Xia Qifei to have him invite Yang Jimei to a banquet in Hua Garden. Presumably, the leading salt merchant in Jiangnan had a lot of silver hidden in his manor. It would not be too difficult for Xia Qifei to borrow silver from him. If Yang Jimei could not raise it by himself, he would mobilize the Jiangnan salt merchants to help. It had to be said that Fan Xian had endured in Jiangnan for 2 or 3 years and had indeed laid down a solid foundation. As long as he did not, on the surface, touch the foundation of the court, he had the ability to gather the power of the Jiangnan business world. This power was truly astonishing. To be able to raise so much silver in such a short time was not something anyone could do. These matters took up an entire day for Fan Xian. At dusk, he left Weizhou and disappeared into the color of blood. From that day onwards, not only did his subordinates in Jiangnan not know where he had gone, even his trusted aides in the Overwatch Council and Qinian unit had completely lost track of him. A young ninth-level ace who had immersed himself in the Overwatch Council for a lifetime purposely put on a disguise and went on the road. He had the ability to avoid everyone's gaze. Just like this, Fan Xian disappeared. After an indeterminable number of days, when the feeling of spring in the heart of the land had reached its peak, a travel-worn figure appeared outside a large call on the border between northern Qi and Dongyi. This place was very remote, but the traffic was not behind because this was a transfer point on an old trade route many years ago. However, it had been abandoned for a long time and had long disappeared from the map. It had also disappeared from many people's hearts. Looking from the outside of the mountain, the place was quiet. Occasionally, there was the sound of dogs barking and chickens crying. There were farmers walking along the road. It was already late at night, but the occasional farmer that appeared did not seem to need a light to see the slightly wet and muddy fields beneath his feet. The figure quietly brushed past these farmers and headed into the mountain. The path toward the mountain seemed to twist and turn like a fish intestine winding back and forth. The travel-worn figure walked straight into the mountain. After walking for an indeterminable amount of time, his clothes dripped with dew and his cloth shoes broke dead branches. Finally, he climbed halfway up the mountain. What had been an overgrown mountain village in front of him turned his head and saw the flickering lights and manners all over the mountain. Countless buildings emanating a fresh smell appeared in the mountain valley like a miracle. The figure threw down the bamboo stick in his hand and looked at the lights in the belly of the mountain. For some reason, he felt very moved in his heart, to the point that his eyes were almost moist. He knew that this scene hidden behind the farm, hidden in the peach blossom spring, had used up a great deal of his energy and money. He didn't know how many people had paid for it. Chapter 666. Busyness, a cold, and a stomachache. These 3 mountains have tormented me for a few days. It is truly tiring. Sigh. In the deep spring of the 10th year of the Qing calendar, Fan Xian came to 10 Family Village for the first time in the secluded mountain village he called Fish Intestines. This mountain village appeared remote and peaceful, deep in the mountains. However, the lights in the night were dazzling. They outshone the multitude of stars in the sky and moved one's heart. There were certainly more than 10 families in 10 Family Village. On the road leading from the main road to the call in the mountains, there were far more than 10 farmers by the fields and springs. Those farmers were not true farmers. They were patrolmen used to block off the inside and outside of the mountains and protect the secrets in the mountains. Fan Xian was able to pass through these lines of defense and easily enter 10 Family Village because of these lines of defense and the particularly meticulous security arrangements. They had all been single-handedly made by him. The defense arrangements that gathered the wisdom of countless officials of the 2nd and 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council were indeed very powerful. When Fan Xian was making the plans, the officials of the Overwatch Council only knew bits and pieces. They had not thought that these blueprints would become reality on the outskirts of a small mountain village in the northeast of the land. Walking along the small mountain path, he had just passed a pond when he saw the densely packed and picturesque buildings revealing their true appearance under the starlight. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He stood there and sighed to himself. He thought that even if outsiders accidentally entered this place, they would probably only think it was a large manor built in the mountains by some wealthy family just by looking at the buildings outside. He stopped and his figure was revealed under the starlight. Then, a dozen crossbow bolts poked out of the darkness and aimed at him. Fan Xian lowered his head and hid his appearance in the darkness. He then pulled up the hood on his back and covered his head. Only then did he take out a small token from his waist and flash it at the crossbow bolts full of murderous intent. A person who looked like a worker walked out of the darkness and carefully approached Fan Xian. He accepted the small token and looked at it carefully for a long time before he waved his hand and had the crossbow bolts disappear in the darkness behind him. The worker led the way, leading Fan Xian around the stone paths between the courtyards. They came to an isolated place. After confirming that no one was watching, he dropped to his knees and said excitedly, "Greetings, Commissioner." Fan Xian looked at him with a slight smile. This was one of the first members of the Qinian unit and an expert that Wang Qinian had helped him recruit back in the day. It had been 2 years since they had seen each other. It was clear that this secret agent had not expected Sir Fan Jr. to suddenly appear in Ten Family Village. It was difficult for him to suppress his excitement. "It's been hard on you these past few years." Fan Xian looked at the worker and said, "For now, don't leak the news of my arrival. First, take me to see the old shopkeepers." "Yes." The worker bowed respectfully and suddenly said, "The old master also came 2 days ago." Fan Xian was shocked and asked, "When did this happen?" 8 days ago." "Quick, take me to him." 2 dark figures walked through the buildings of Ten Family Village under the accompaniment of starlight. Fan Xian couldn't resist using his peripheral vision to size up these buildings that were different in height from normal residences. He looked at the specially designed doors, windows, and ventilation systems. He wondered if they were empty or already filled with things. Although everything in this village had been built bit by bit with the silver he had provided, it was still a very important matter. Thus, Fan Xian had cut himself off from everything here these 2 years. Even his most loyal subordinates in Jiangnan did not know that he had hidden such a village in a certain corner of the land. This was also Fan Xian's first time coming here personally. Other than feeling moved and sentimental, he also couldn't help but be curious. He wondered what those people, silver, and blueprints had changed the village in the 2 years after they were gathered together. The two of them walked into a small courtyard deep in the village. There was still a dim light in the room, making Fan Xian's shadow appear very thin and long as it fell on the stone steps. Fan Xian quietly said something to the secret agent of the Qinian unit. The secret agent smiled and left. He did not arrange for anyone to guard this place. If someone could actually enter deep into Ten Family Village and threaten Sir Fan Jr., then it would be unnecessary to send anyone else. Fan Xian tidied his clothes outside the room and walked in. Facing the stern-looking middle-aged man behind the desk, he knelt down on both knees and made a full bow. In a sincere voice, he said, "Greetings, Father." The retired Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, had not been in Danzhou to be filial to his mother and take Lady Lu on a trip to the sea. Instead, he had appeared in this small mountain village between Dongyi and northern Qi. This was truly an unexpected scene. Minister Fan looked at his son in front of him. Surprise flashed through his heart. Immediately, it became complicated. He smiled warmly and helped him up. The father and son had not seen each other for more than 2 years. They were worthy of Fan Xian's bow. However, the former minister knew that his son was not someone who liked to kneel to others. From this kneel, he vaguely sensed something. Fan Jian did not open his mouth to ask. Fan Xian also did not say that from his sister's mouth and the story of the past, he had already guessed what kind of painful price the Fan Manor had paid for his survival. "Father, why have you personally come?" Fan Xian helped his father sit properly in the chair. Looking at the faint white hair on his head, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Counting his years, his father should be in his hometown in retirement. However, because of Fan Xian's matters, these 2 years had still tired the old man out. His father's personal visit to Ten Family Village made him feel a glimmer of surprise. Fan Jian smiled slightly and said, "Although I am in Danzhou and can remotely control the construction of this place, after 3 years of accumulation, constant dripping wears away a rock. The preparatory work for Ten Family Village is pretty much done. If you truly have the courage to rebuild a palace treasury here, if I don't personally oversee it, I cannot be at ease no matter what." A second palace treasury? So, this remote Ten Family Village bore the weight of Fan Xian's great ambition. Ever since the Jingdou Rebellion, Fan Xian had secretly rescued a number of old Qingyu Hall shopkeepers from the capital. Additionally, he had been in charge of the palace treasury for a long time. A few years ago, he had made a copy of the palace treasury techniques in North Min additionally, with his present wealth and power, as well as the innate things in his transmigrated soul. If the heavens were truly willing to give him 10 years, perhaps he could actually turn this remote mountain village into a second palace treasury. What was the palace treasury? It was the foundation that supported the Qing kingdom's military strength for 30 years. It was an endless source that the Qing emperor used to supplement the national treasury and people's livelihood. It was not an exaggeration to say that the palace treasury was one of the two sources of the Qing kingdom's strength. The other was the emperor himself. However, Fan Xian wanted to rebuild a palace treasury outside of the Qing kingdom. Without question, this was the most important decision Fan Xian had made in his life. If this decision truly became a reality many years later, the entire world would change because of this matter. The Qing kingdom would no longer have the natural ability to smile proudly in the world. What exactly did Fan Xian want to do? Presently, the situation in the world was complicated. Furthermore, this matter was a major matter that could shake the foundation of the Qing kingdom. Thus, during these 2 years, Fan Jian and Fan Xian had worked in great secrecy. Progress had been slow. They only hoped to not draw the attention of the people under heaven and did not ask for speed. If, in the future, a second palace treasury truly appeared outside the Qing kingdom's borders, it went without saying what kind of powerful blow and damage it would bring to the Qing kingdom's national strength. Thus, Fan Xian hid this matter from everyone under heaven. He only dared to carefully discuss it with his father in secret. If you leave Danzhou for too long, I'm afraid it will cause discussion. Fan Xian was not in a hurry to discuss the problem of a second palace treasury with his father. Instead, he spoke with slight worry. Although Fan Jian had retired, seeing how the emperor had used a sword to kill people and slaughtered over 100 tiger guards, the emperor did not trust this trusted companion he had grown up with. Presumably, there were many spies from the palace stationed in Danzhou. If Fan Jian was not willing to retire in Danzhou, the news of him leaving Danzhou should immediately be sent back to Jingdou. Your Overwatch Council combed through Danzhou, and my people combed through it again. Fan Jian gazed at his son and smiled warmly. The emperor does indeed appear to be undefeatable, but he is not a god. His energy is limited. It is impossible for him to grasp all the minute changes under heaven, particularly since you are secretly hiding it from him. As for me leaving Danzhou, it was originally to wander around Dongyi. The smile of the previous minister appeared slightly amused. Before I entered the Ministry of Revenue, I was a famous wastrel in Jingdou. Now that I have retired and returned to my hometown, it is natural for me to go to a prosperous place like Dongyi to paint some beauties. The emperor cannot fly into a rage because of this. It's still not appropriate. I just come occasionally to take a look and keep an eye on the progress. Fan Xian looked at his father. Other than worry, there was also an additional sense of guilt. He had never wanted his father and Chen Pingping to be involved in this incomparably dangerous matter. However, when it came to the matter of 10 family village, at the beginning, he had no clue at all. How could they rebuild a palace treasury from nothing? He was not his mother, Yi Qingmei. Although he had a ready-made old shopkeeper of the Yi family, who had once experienced the construction of the palace treasury in North Min, had a large pile of records of the various processes of the palace treasury, and was even familiar with the layout of the 3 workshops of the palace treasury in North Min, he still felt lost and retreated when it came to building a new palace treasury. The night before Minister Fan left Jingdou, he talked with him for an entire night and cleared up many of his doubts. When Minister Fan discovered that his son was using the eldest princess rebellion to prepare to rescue the old shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall in Jingdou, he knew what Fan Xian was thinking in his heart. Thus, he spoke openly and honestly to his son. Building another palace treasury is more difficult than you imagine. This is an inauspicious matter that will shake the Qing kingdom and change the situation of the entire world. That night, Minister Fan said to him with sincere and heartfelt words, "I am a person of the Qing kingdom. Of course, I do not want you to do this. If you can convince me, you can leave the beginning matters to me. At that time, Fan Xian did not want to completely break off relations with the Qing emperor. He also did not want to become a sinner of the Qing kingdom and put the Qing kingdom he had grown up in into great danger. However, he still unconsciously began to dig up the foundations of the Qing kingdom. He only used 2 sentences to convince Fan Xian. This is not the palace treasury. This is what Mother left for this world. If Mother was still alive, she would not want the emperor to use her legacy to satisfy his personal ambitions. But, your mother also hoped for the world to be unified. I don't understand those very mysterious things, but I understand women, Fan Xian said to his father in that quiet night. That quiet night, Fan Xian said very seriously to his father, I only know that if Mother was alive, she would not want the wealth she left behind to forever be held in the hands of the man who murdered her. Minister Fan was silent for a long time that night. He then nodded. With this nod, 2 years passed. The father and son, who had the most money in their hands, began to secretly do something that was destined to shock the world. Perhaps what the 2 of them had done was too inconceivable, so not a single force had found out about it. This was also the result of Fan Xian's extreme caution. During these 2 years, other than the secret flow of money, he did not use any of the power at hand to help 10 family village grow. This little village was like a child who had been released into the wild, slowly growing among the green grass of the mountain. As for whether he would continue to release the sheep after he grew up or be released into the wild, that was a matter for many years in the future. Fan Xian did not ask him what Fan Xian would use 10 family village for if, many years from now, 2 palace treasuries truly appeared in this world. Fan Xian also did not ask his father why, as a subject of the Qing kingdom, he would make such a choice just because of the grudge between his mother and the emperor. The old shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall, who had escaped from Jingdo, came to 10 family village. The craftsmanship secrets Fan Xian had stolen from the palace treasury came to 10 family village. Minister Fan's most secretive power also came to 10 family village. The silver Fan Xian had gathered from all over the world also came to 10 family village and the depression deep in the mountains. Secrets, money, and martial power fermented in this obscure little place for 2 years. No matter how careful the Fan father and son were, 10 family village was already prepared to expand. They had completed all the basic construction and were ready to become a second palace treasury. Thus, Minister Fan had the black-clothed knife man bring a message to Fan Xian that a large sum of silver was needed. This point of time was actually much earlier than Fan Xian had originally predicted. From the beginning of the plan, he had never thought that he could be mentioned in the same breath as his mother, Yi Qingmei. Yi Qingmei had not taken many years to build the palace treasury because she had the support of the entire Qing royal family and Uncle Wu Zhu to protect her. Furthermore, her abilities had always far surpassed Fan Xian's. Minister Fan clearly saw Fan Xian's confusion. He smiled warmly and said, "Those old fellows of Qingyu Hall were all old people who had participated in the building of the palace treasury. This is the second time, so it should be easier." Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. "But, it's still faster than I thought. When we were repairing the palace treasury." Minister Fan seemed to think of many years ago in the wastelands of North Min. He smiled. "Your mother was actually impatient and didn't want to deal with these details. Lao Wu was someone who wouldn't open his mouth even once a year. Thus, I did all of these small and mundane tasks. So, he was the supervisor of the building of the palace treasury. No wonder 10 family village had developed so quickly." Fan Xian looked at his father and involuntarily felt a sense of admiration. He thought to himself that there was indeed a reason why the emperor was so afraid of his father and was willing to lose 100 tiger guards to wipe clean his father's power in the capital. Furthermore, 10 family village's location is good. You've never been here before, so I didn't have the opportunity to tell you. Minister Fan continued to smile, but the red streaks in his eyes revealed his exhaustion. After all, he was getting on in years. Regardless of whether it was in Danzhou or here, this former Minister of Revenue had single-handedly taken care of such important matters. His mind was exhausted. Fan Xian spread out a large map on the table. It was flat. Fan Xian moved closer and used the dim light to look at the markings on the map. Because of the markings, he easily found the tiny 10-family village in the middle and east of the map. His eyes gradually lit up. The geographical location of 10-family village was indeed as his father had said. It was miraculous. If, in the future, they could open the road to the southeast and directly reach the shores of the East Sea, it would be easy to reach Dongyi. If 10-family village remained quiet, the people outside would have no idea what was happening inside. If we act immediately, there will be a large amount of supplies entering. It will no longer be like the ants moving around the past 2 years. It will certainly draw the attention of many people. Even if your silver is in your account, don't think twice about whether or not to act. Fan Xian saw the faint excitement in Fan Xian's heart and reminded him with a smile. Fan Xian's smile immediately became bitter. If he truly wanted to turn 10-family village into the palace treasury of North Min, hiring was one reason. Large amounts of supplies entering was another. The simple blast furnace and steel installation could not be hidden from the eyes of an idiot. Everyone would probably guess what was going on inside. Given the importance of the palace treasury to the Qin kingdom, as long as the court discovered the slightest abnormality, the emperor would not hesitate to send troops to the north and attack Dongyi at all costs, destroying the embryonic form of the new palace treasury in 10-family village. Of course, even if the emperor sends troops to attack, the location of 10-family village is special. It is easy to ask for reinforcements. It will not be easy to attack. Fan Xian's thinking manner was not like that of a Qing official. He was more like a traitor. Coldly, he said, 10-family village was originally the Yi family village. Most of your mother's subordinates came from this village. In order to protect the secret of this place, the Yi family village changed its name and became the 10-family village of today. And this village was the first place your mother chose when she built the palace treasury. However, for some other reason, she relocated the location of the palace treasury within the Qin kingdom, to North Min, which is very close to Quanzhou. We chose 10-family village anew because we believe in your mother's foresight. Fan Jian looked at Fan Xian calmly and said, other than your mother and Lao Wu, only I knew of this position. It is easy to defend and difficult to attack. More importantly, this is a place that none of the 3 powers in the world can fully devote themselves to. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then said, I would rather be careful and slow than let the emperor discover any clues. Your mother is no longer here. Although we have many natural advantages in our hands, it is impossible to build a palace treasury in 10-family village out of thin air without a number of years of effort and the power of a country. Fan Xian closed his eyes slightly. You had the intention to move the palace treasury out of the Qin kingdom to use this as a pretense to threaten the emperor. It was necessary to be cautious at the beginning. Fan Xian was not surprised that his father had so easily seen through his thoughts. In a quiet voice, he said, even if it is a pretense, it has to be real. Furthermore, who knows what will happen many years later? After all, the emperor is not a god. There will come a day when he will die. Thus, the moment you agreed to move a large amount of silver into 10-family village, I began to have doubts. Fan Xian opened his eyes and sighed heavily. Do you think the emperor will actually act against Chen Pingping? Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, I don't know. Fan Xian's gaze pressed on him coldly. What if the emperor actually moves? Fan Xian was silent and didn't answer the question. He only thought of the 10-family village that his cloth shoes had stepped on. This village was still very quiet now, but in the future, it would certainly be incomparably dazzling. Regardless of how the internal affairs of the Qin court developed or whether or not there would be a great battle, Fan Xian always maintained one attitude in his heart. The palace treasury was not the palace treasury. It had come from a distant world and should benefit the people of the present. It could not become the logistics department of a vast army. Presumably, Yi Qingmei also thought this way. A certain person had killed her, and her things still had to help him fight for the world. If Yi Qingmei knew of this, her heart would certainly hurt. Fan Xian felt great pity for the mother he had never met. The more he felt pity for her, the more he didn't want her heart to hurt. Chapter 667. In a quiet little courtyard, a quiet person, and a quiet chest, there was a similar amount of pain. Minister Fan carried a glimmer of pity and warmth as he looked at his son, who had his head lowered and was speechless. After a moment of silence, he quietly asked, "Let's not talk about Chen Pingping. I only want to ask you. From the moment you decided to personally step into 10 Family Village, presumably you already knew about the matter from many years ago. Regarding that matter, how are you going to deal with it?" Fan Xian did not reply. Instead, he asked, "When did you think of it?" Probably after the Jingdou rebellion. Fan Jian's expression was calm. Fan Jian's expression was calm as he said in a gentle voice, "Even if I wanted to, I didn't want to think about it in that direction. In the end, the emperor is the emperor, and I am his official. I started thinking in that direction a long time ago," Fan Xian said bitterly. "At that time, I had already guessed my past, but I didn't have a shred of good feelings toward the emperor. So, when I thought in that direction, I could accept it emotionally. But..." He let out a slow breath and said in a slightly raspy voice, "Later, the emperor treated me better and better. I was less and less willing to think in that direction, even though I knew long ago that other than him, no one in this world could banish Yi Qingmei from this world. But, I didn't want to think in that direction." Fan Xian's brows were furrowed tightly. "For the first time, I felt confused. In the past, I had once told you that I would not allow anyone to control me. My will was strong enough and would never be disturbed by external things. However, on this matter, I was truly beginning to feel confused." He raised his head and glanced at his father helplessly. "If you were in my position, what would you do?" Concerning this question, Fan Xian had actually thought about it clearly on the banks of the Lujing River in Jingdou by the side of the grave. However, Fan Jian should have the power and right to speak on this matter. Thus, Fan Xian had come to 10 Family Village, to Qing Kingdom's fish intestine, and quietly listened to his father's instructions. Fan Jian was silent for a long time. He then looked at him and asked, "You have to ask your heart how you really think of the emperor. That depends on how he thinks of me." Fan Xian followed these words very quickly. Presumably, he had asked himself countless times over the countless nights. "What does he think of you?" Fan Jian warmly smiled and said, "You don't have to worry about my attitude. After all, he and I grew up together. Although I feel disappointed and resentful towards him, to be honest, I can't bring myself to hate him too much." Fan Xian smiled helplessly and then sank into deep thought. Concerning this matter, he had thought about it many, many times. Before the Jingdou rebellion, the emperor probably felt 30% guilty toward Fan Xian, 30% valued him, and 40% used him. After so many people had died in the palace, the emperor's personality had clearly changed a great deal. Starting from the spring when he entered the capital in the 4th year of the Qing calendar, Fan Xian had to admit that perhaps the emperor was a harsh and merciless person. However, when it came to how he treated him, there was indeed an anomaly. Even if he had been used in the past, it was an acceptable use. If the emperor still had a sliver of true affection for the people of this world, then that sliver would fall on Fan Xian's head. The emperor treated Fan Xian better than the crown prince and the second prince, much less that pitiful woman who had given up her youth and reputation for the emperor. Quietly listening to Fan Xian's words, Fan Jian gently stroked the beard on his chin and sighed. "It is easy to change mountains and rivers, but it is difficult to change a person's nature. Even though the emperor's personality has become much warmer, in the end, he is still a ruler who thinks of the world as his own. Speaking of which, how you treat the emperor depends on how the emperor treats you. However, how the emperor treats you depends on how you treat him. He looked at his young son and said with slight worry, "The emperor treats you differently because ever since you entered the capital, you have always displayed unwavering loyalty. This is also something I admire about you. You are young, yet you know how to guess what you have guessed and cover up all the conflicts in your heart. You even hid it from the emperor's eyes. However, once the emperor becomes interested, you are not a simple official. Once he truly begins to doubt your loyalty, there will be a fundamental change in his attitude toward you." The emperor is heartless, Fan Jian reminded him. Particularly when the power in your hands is so great that it can even faintly threaten the stability of the Qing kingdom's dragon throne. If he discovers that there is something strange in your heart, he will certainly mobilize the absolute power in his hands to kill you. Fan Xian was silent. He knew what his father said was right. The biggest problem he had committed in his planning these few years was that he had never made up his mind. Regardless of whether it was to avenge Yi Qingmei or to wipe away the events of the past and obediently and timidly be a powerful official by the dragon throne, he had to make a decision ahead of time. His mind was so uncertain and indecisive right now. It was truly too embarrassing. "This is a difficult problem for anyone to solve," Fan Xian said with a bitter smile. He smiled bitterly and thought to himself that in his previous life, such a dramatic conflict and inner struggle could probably only be found in Shakespeare's plays. Who would have thought that the drama of a father killing his mother and the son being caught in the middle would actually fall on him? Fan Xian looked at him calmly with a strange gaze. A moment later, he said, "Actually, after Chen Pingping confirmed that matter and I guessed it, he and I also considered your problem. However, we truly did not think that it was a problem that was difficult to resolve." Fan Xian didn't quite understand these words. Fan Xian looked at him. His gaze grew gentler and gentler. He sighed and said, "Anji, you truly are an extraordinary person. I had thought that you had never seen your birth mother and had grown up under the emperor's protection. The emperor had treated you very well. Logically speaking, you shouldn't have any deep feelings for Xiao Yezi. Given the affection the emperor had for you, even if you knew about the tragedy of the past, you probably wouldn't be able to summon up the thought of revenge against the emperor for your birth mother." Fan Xian couldn't resist shaking his head and said, "Sometimes, I really don't understand you." Fan Xian had never seen Yi Qingmei in his life. He hadn't grown up healthily under her care. The emperor had treated him well. "The hatred of killing my mother is absolutely irreconcilable?" Fan Xian said quietly self-mockingly. "Of course, you know that I could not have made a decision because of this reason. It was because Yi Qingmei's aura in this world made Fan Xian feel so familiar, so close, and so amiable. Perhaps it had nothing to do with the feelings of a mother and son. It was just that two connected souls had suddenly gotten closer and closer in this spacious and bustling other world. For Fan Xian, Yi Qingmei was someone who had gone before. Someone who had come and then left, another version of himself. Not fair." Fan Xian looked at his father. For some reason, his heart ached. In an indescribable tone, he quietly said, "If we just let it go like this, it would be too unfair to her." Minister Fan was silent for a long time. He then said, "It is indeed unfair." Perhaps it was because of the word unfair that the old cripple in the Overwatch Council had endured silently for 20 years and planned for 20 years. Carefully and miraculously, he had followed the general trend of the world and the court. He had spent countless efforts to drive all of the emperor's people, one by one, to the opposite side of the emperor. It was said that if there were dogs in the world, Ping Ping would chase them. In the end, the old cripple had finally succeeded. Everything that had happened in the 7th year of the Qing calendar had been a point he had calculated and waited for a long time. Under the circumstances at the time, the Qing emperor faced the greatest danger of his life. The wind had risen on Dong Mountain and gathered clouds. However, the emperor had still returned alive from Dong Mountain. The justice Chen Pingping wanted became a flower in the mirror and a shadow in the water. He would not be able to find a second chance. I have to make arrangements for Chen Pingping first. Fan Xian had already shaken off his earlier emotions. Looking at his father, he quietly said, "Of the old comrades from back then, some have died, some have rebelled, and some are still struggling. The director is different from you. He has always been dissatisfied. That is why he has endured in Jingdo these 2 years. Now that you have taken the position of director, it looks like the emperor still wants to give us old fellows a way out," Fan Xian said with a warm smile. Fan Jian smiled warmly. "As long as nothing unforeseen happens, His Majesty will probably let that old dog leave the capital. Don't worry." A faint worry rose in Fan Xian's heart. He didn't know where this worry came from. He just felt that things wouldn't go so smoothly. In his original plan, after Chen Pingping and his father were far away from Jingdo, he would deal with the emperor alone in Jingdo and use the Dongi matter to delay the emperor's steps for 2 years. He would listen to his words and observe his actions. It could be considered a safe move. Seeing the worry between Fan Xian's brows, Minister Fan furrowed his brows and asked, "Is there any new movement in Jingdo?" "It is still the same as in the past year. The Imperial Censorate checks and balances the Overwatch Council, and Hizongwei is doing very well." Fan Xian shook his head. Recently, other than Sun Jingxiu's side, nothing major has happened in the capital. Minister Fan's expression froze slightly. He asked about the matter of the Jingdo government a while ago. After thinking silently for a long time, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, "This matter is strange." Fan Xian was slightly surprised and looked at his father. He didn't know where to start. The internal strife in the officialdom in Jingdo was clearly on a completely different level compared to the major matter the father and son had discussed earlier. Yet, his father took it so seriously. From the Imperial Censorate to the Hall of Governmental Affairs and then you taking over the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian said in a cold voice. Fan Jian said in a cold voice, "This is something we have discussed before. The emperor has arranged for the Qing kingdom behind him. At the moment, Dongyi is still negotiating. The matter of the northern expedition has not even begun to be prepared. The emperor's arrangement this time is clearly too rushed. He wants to help Hizongwei into power to check and balance you, causing these things." Fan Xian shook his head and sighed. Too rushed, too rushed. Fan Xian understood his father's words and also sank into deep thought. It was indeed so. During these 2 years, the emperor seemed to have been too anxious to make future arrangements for the Qing court. His speed had been a bit too rushed. A gust of mountain wind blew in through the open glass window, bringing with it a chill. The light in the study flickered for a while, illuminating the father and son's expressions. After a moment of oppressive silence, Fan Xian lowered his voice and said, "Is there something wrong with the emperor's body?" Fan Xian thought for a long time and then shook his head. "You have more people in the palace than I do, even more than Chen Pingping. If you haven't received any news, then it cannot be confirmed. But, if the emperor truly has a problem with his body, he would certainly hide it," Fan Xian said with a heavy expression. "If he is sick, he has to go to the Imperial Academy of Medicine for treatment." Fan Xian looked at him and said. "As long as there is a record in the Imperial Academy of Medicine, presumably you have the ability to see it." "No." Fan Xian shook his head. "These 2 years, I have been paying close attention to this area, but there has been no news in the palace. If there is something wrong with the emperor's body and he has not summoned the imperial doctors to treat it, then there is only one reason." Fan Xian sat up straight and slowly said, "The problem with the emperor's body is something he knows very well. It is impossible for the imperial doctors to cure it. Fan Xian's heart jumped and he unconsciously said, "Is there still a problem with the tyrannical Zhenqi that has reached the realm of the way of the emperor?" Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. Logically speaking, at the realm of a great grandmaster, normal poisons should not be able to enter the heart meridians. What problem could there be? Never mind, this is just a wild guess from you and me without any reason. You can't take this matter seriously. Fan Xian also smiled and said, "That is true. However, I am very interested in how the emperor crossed that barrier and practiced the way of the King's Scroll. It is a pity that the emperor always said that I would not be able to use that method, so I have never had a clue." "Where are you going next?" Fan Xian suddenly asked. "To Dongyi." Fan Xian was startled. He didn't know why his father would suddenly ask this. "Concerning the matter of the nameless marshal's secret, I can't give any opinion. Since you are going to Dongyi, there should be someone you can ask about whether or not the emperor has a problem with his cultivation." Fan Xian looked at him calmly and said, "Sigu Jian is about to die. Before he dies, if you can make some progress, you will be able to protect yourself in the future." Fan Xian laughed bitterly. It was difficult to improve one step further. Although Sigu Jian had already taught him everything he knew in Dongyi, what could he do? However, he knew his father was right. Concerning the secret of the nameless marshal's secret and how the emperor was able to break through the final restrictions of the tyrannical scroll on the human body, Sigu Jian was, without question, his last teacher. Chapter 668. I haven't been feeling well. Maybe it's because the legendary days have finally arrived. The low tide, the so-called low tide, has finally arrived. I don't know if it's a psychological problem or something else, but I'm under a lot of pressure. I can't extricate myself. I've been sitting there for 4 hours, but my mind is empty. I'm not drunk, I'm not sick, there's nothing. I just can't write anymore. My hands are placed on the keyboard, and I start to feel disgusted. This state is very strange. It happened twice when I was writing about Suzaku, but this is the first time I'm writing about the year after Qingyu. I've tried to analyze my recent mental state. Being busy and tired is part of the reason, but I think the real reason why I'm writing harder and harder is the year of Qingyu itself. This story is slowly coming to an end. Maybe it's because I subconsciously don't want to write the end, so I'm starting to feel disgusted with every word I type. Because there's a fixed content, every additional word you write will reduce the content of the story by 1 word, and then it will get smaller and smaller, until there's nothing left. I'm sick of this feeling. It's probably the same feeling I had when I read the last half of Jin Yong's novel 20 years ago and saw the number of pages between my thumb and index finger dwindle. I need to rest for a day. I need to adjust my mental state, and then force myself to wake up and fall into madness. I don't have any craziness, it's like I can't overcome it. I don't know if other writers have this feeling, but I do. I won't add this chapter. On the 15th, I'll only add the chapter where I asked for sick leave. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.